Chapter 1. Road Dark. The morning report came with the same efficiency it had for the last 3 days. Soren's voice steady, numbers exact, the kind of precision that came from a man who had mapped the same terrain in his head longer than he'd admitted. "Water consumption is running 0.5% under estimate," he said. The caravan had slowed to half pace as we moved deeper into the ash waste, and the crew was rationing with the discipline of people who understood the consequence of waste. "If the well at Tal-Veshaan runs clean, we'll arrive with reserves." I stood at the wagon window, coffee cooling in my hands. The desert was doing what the desert did this time of year, heating methodically without drama. By midday the thermometer would spike past the point where thinking became a luxury. Now, in the first light, the air was sharp and the horizon was clear. "How long to the oasis?" I said. 3 days if the ridge formations don't shift the water table." Soren had been studying the stone channels all morning, the way the earth spoke its water music, as he called it. A skill that had no name in the trade guild's ledgers, but was worth more than gold when the wells ran dry. The calculations held 3 seasons ago. No reason they shouldn't hold now. I nodded. 3 days meant we reached Tal-Veshaan with the crew still steady and the horses holding condition. It meant the schedule stayed intact. It meant no delays, and delays were a luxury that the caravan deadline would not allow. 3 days had passed since Darian told me what rode in my wagons. 3 days since I had gathered the crew at dusk, named Amberless for what it was, and watched the knowledge move through them like heat through metal. Raihan had wanted him off the road. Lyra had gone white around the mouth. Yasmin had asked one question, whether the cases were stable, and then started calculating where to move the cook fire. Darian had not defended himself. He had stood at the edge of the circle and said only that I had the truth now, late, and that late did not make it clean. I had kept him. Not because I forgave him. Because Parisa was still east, the contract was still real, the deadline still moved whether I trusted the man who had brought it to me or not. Trust had not been restored in those 3 days. Function had. On the road, sometimes that was the first mercy. Yasmin appeared in the wagon doorway, her arms full of bread and the morning's rations. She was moving with the easy competence she'd developed over 8 years on the route, the way of a person who had stopped thinking about the road and started living it. Behind her, the camp was braking with quiet efficiency. Raihan was checking the wagon hitches. Lyra had her ledger out, counting and recounting like she still thought numbers could be trusted to stay in place. And Darian was standing at the fire pit, watching the crew with the careful attention of someone who was still learning the pattern of it all. 3 days ago, that watching would have made my crew nervous. Now Raihan just moved around him the way you'd move around any fixture, neutral. Lyra glanced up and away. Only Soren held his gaze steady, not with welcome, but with the neutral regard of a man who had decided to wait and see. "Raihan's horse has a tendon strain," Yasmin said, handing me the rations. "Minor, but it will need rest before we push pace again." I took the bread and held it, thinking. A tendon strain was not critical, but it was not nothing. Push the horse now, and we'd lose a full day at some point in the next week. Rest it now, and we'd gain time in the long account. "We'll address it at the water stop," I said. "Full examination, redistribute the load to Lyra's wagon if we need to. No rushing." Yasmin nodded. She had known what I would say before I said it. That was the contract between a crew and a captain who had proven she knew how to read the desert. You didn't have to waste words. She handed me the coffee flask and turned to go. 3 days ago," she said, pausing in the doorway. No one would have trusted that call. I looked at her. There was something warm underneath the statement, underneath the observation. Not softness, but recognition. Yasmin did not traffic in false comfort. If she was remarking on a thing, it was because the thing was true and worth noting. "I'm running from my own clarity now," I said. "Not from Bahram's shadow." She smiled, thin and knowing. "About time." She left. I finished the coffee and dressed in the light clothing I'd learned wore best in the ash waste, loose layers, dyed to hold the heat without absorbing it, the kind of precision that came from watching 10 seasons of caravans come and go. The rope burn on my palm had faded almost to white over the decade since I'd earned it, a private mark I pressed once, briefly, the way some women pressed a locket at the throat before stepping out of doors. The crew was ready when I came out of the wagon. The amberless was distributed across 3 wagons, sitting in weighted cases that had been locked and sealed by my hand on the day we left Suhari. I could see the weight of it in the way the wagon frame settled, the slight extra sag in the suspension. 40 cases of crystallized resin, each one heavy enough to require 2 hands and the knowledge of what it was. What it actually was. That knowledge still sat wrong in my chest. But there was no time for the wrongness to settle into anger or something worse. There was only the road and the deadline and the work. Soren had the maps out and was double-checking the route markers. Rayhan was circling her lame horse, assessing, her posture the neutral professional stance of someone who had seen worse and would see worse again. Lyra had finished her count and had moved on to checking the leather ties on the wagon covers. Darian remained near the fire pit, close enough to be useful if called and far enough not to mistake tolerance for welcome. The work was good work. Honest work. "Report," I said, my voice loud enough to carry across the camp. The crew responded in the order they always did. Yasmin on supplies. Rayhan on animals. Soren on navigation. Lyra on inventory. No surprises. No deviations. The caravan was running clean. I nodded once and moved to Rayhan's horse, crouching down to examine the leg she'd identified. The tendon ran up from the fetlock with the familiar warmth of inflammation, the kind of heat that came from uneven weight distribution, or a small twist in the terrain. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that wouldn't settle with rest and careful motion. "The water stop," I said, standing. "Full examination, cold compress, and we'll redistribute the load. The horse gets a day once we reach Tal-Veshaan if the well is clean." Rayhan straightened. Her eyes held the particular recognition that came from working with someone who understood the equation. An animal's condition was not separate from the caravan's timeline. One affected the other, and you calculated both together. "You know, 3 days ago no one would have made that call," she said. I looked at her. Her expression was neutral, but there was something underneath, not skepticism, but the warm regard of someone who had been waiting for this version of me to show up. "Different captain," I said. She nodded. "Better one." The crew assembled one last time before we broke camp. I stood with my hands on the wagon rim, feeling the heat of the wood already beginning to radiate from the morning sun. The amberless was loaded. The supplies were checked. The horses were rested except for Rayhan's mount, which would recover fine. Everything was in place. Everything except the knowledge that the ash waste lay ahead, and beyond it, the oasis town Soren had mentioned only in passing. The place where water stopped and power began, where a man named Hassoun ran the waystation like a carefully balanced trade, where the caravan would need to negotiate not just for supplies, but for the right to move forward at all. Yasmin was standing near the banked fire, her arms crossed. When she caught my eye, she gave me a look that held no anxiety, no warning, just the steady regard of a woman who had been watching the desert long enough to understand that it was always coming, whatever came next. "There it is," Soren said, pointing east. We all turned. The horizon was still mostly empty ash waste, that flat, dark plain that stretched toward nothing. But on the far edge, where the land crinkled toward the distant rock formations, there was a smudge of green. Not the green of trees exactly. The green of life sustained by water, by an underground source that had been running for thousands of years. Tal-Veshaan. 3 days, as promised. The oasis rendered in miniature, a small promise on the horizon that the desert could be negotiated if you knew the right people and said the right things. If you didn't show weakness. If you remembered that water was a currency, and anyone who controlled it could extract whatever price they wanted. Hassoun runs a tight station, Yasmin said quietly, her voice beside me now. Fair tribute, fast turnaround. But he'll ask for every piece of leverage he can find. I filed that. Not a warning exactly. More like the kind of observation that came from someone who had seen the pattern repeat enough times to recognize it in advance. I don't negotiate with time, I said. I negotiate with goods. Yasmin smiled. I know. The crew moved into the wagons. Soren took the lead position. The supply wagon rolled forward, followed by the second carrying most of our crew supplies, and then the third with Lyra's careful inventory. Darian appeared at the rear, moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned in 3 days where to stand and what to do. The morning was clear. The route was marked. The Amberless sat heavy in the wagons, waiting. And Tal-Veshaan waited on the horizon, green and still, like the surface of water before it breaks. I took the position behind Rayhan's wagon, where I could see the whole caravan at once. The crew was steady. The horses were moving well despite the heat. The supplies were secure. Move, I said. The caravan rolled forward, dust rising in the wake of the lead wagon. Behind us, the camp we'd occupied for the night disappeared into the dunes. Ahead of us, the ash waste stretched toward the green smudge that marked the oasis. Darian appeared beside me as we crested the first low ridge. He had learned to move quietly in 3 days, the habit of someone who had spent a long time not being seen. Get some rest, I said. Tomorrow changes things. He nodded. He didn't ask what changes. He had learned that too, that some questions were not questions yet, just the waiting shape of something that would resolve itself on its own time. I watched the caravan move forward into the morning heat, the Amberless riding steady in its cases, the crew moving with the discipline of people who had chosen this path and were not having second thoughts. Everything I thought I knew had been wrong 3 days ago. The desert was still teaching me to recalculate, one small adjustment at a time. Tal-Veshaan waited ahead, and Hassoun with it, and whatever the oasis would demand in exchange for water and passage. But for now, the road was clear. The crew was steady. And we had 3 days before the negotiation began. 3 days to prepare for whatever came next. Chapter 2. Water Bargain. The morning was already hot when Darian pulled his horse alongside the lead wagon. He'd learned, over the past 2 days, that there was a particular moment when the ash waste transitioned from bearable to hostile. It was happening now. The light had that sharp quality, the kind that made the horizon shimmer. "Why does the crew follow you?" he said. I didn't look at him. My hands were steady on the reins, the way they always were. Because I know where the water is and how fast we can move between wells. That's not what I mean. I went still. It was a small thing, the kind of stillness that most people wouldn't notice. But Darian had spent the last 2 days learning the patterns of the caravan, which meant he'd spent the last 2 days learning the patterns of me. My jaw tightened slightly, a fraction of a second where I stopped breathing. "Because I don't ask them for things I won't pay for myself," I said. The words came slower than usual, which meant I was thinking them as I spoke them. And I've never wasted their time. He nodded. Not like he'd won an argument. Like he'd understood something about the architecture of trust that had nothing to do with competence and everything to do with the one currency no one could earn back once it was spent. We rode in silence for another hour. The caravan settled into the rhythm it had found over the past 3 days. Steady pace, no wasted motion, the kind of efficient movement that came from a crew that had learned to trust the person at the front. At the water stop, everything moved like clockwork. Soren guided the wagons to the well with the same confidence he'd shown since we left Suhari. I dismounted before the dust had settled, walking the perimeter of our setup with the mechanical precision that kept chaos from taking root. Water stops were where mistakes lived, where a crew's attention wandered because water was guaranteed, because the well had been here yesterday and would be here tomorrow. I found Rayhan checking the horse harnesses. Her fingers moved along each buckle with the focus of someone who understood that a single failure meant 2 days of delay in the open desert. The sun had already burned through her shirt at the shoulders, and there was a thin line of salt marking where her collar had rubbed all week. "The draft ox on the north wagon is favoring the left foreleg," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked up, and something in his bearing shifted, not defensiveness, just the concentration of a man who'd been caught mid-thought and appreciated the interruption. "Noticed it this morning. Checking the pad now. Shouldn't be more than a day's rest. One wagon stays behind if it can't be fixed by evening. Make the call." He nodded, already turning back to his work with the knowledge that I'd trust whatever decision he made. That was the thing about authority that most people got wrong. It wasn't about being seen commanding. It was about asking once and never needing to ask again. I moved to the wagons themselves, checking the water containers, our lifeblood out here. Each one sealed, each weight distributed across the frame in the pattern we'd established. I ran my hand along the leather strapping, feeling for looseness. Found none. That was Soren's work. That was also how I knew he'd been checking them without me asking. Yasmin appeared from the direction of the well with a water skin, and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been watching the conversation happen from a distance and had decided to offer me a way back to the surface. The small gestures. The ones that mattered. "The crew's asking about Tal-Veshaan," she said. "What's the stop?" 3 days, I said. "Resupply, repairs, move on." She nodded. That was certainty. That was knowing exactly what was waiting at the oasis and having already calculated the cost of getting there. No hesitation meant no delay. No delay meant the crew would have time to rest before we moved again. I accepted the water skin she offered, felt the cold weight of it in my hands. Behind her, I could see Lyra at the well, moving with the economical motion of someone who'd already calculated the water ratios for the next leg. Her numbers cut through the heat like shorthand. The crew didn't question them. They moved. "Darian's asking the right questions," Yasmin said, low enough that only I could hear. "Makes sense he's thinking about what moves us forward." It was a small remark, the kind that could have meant anything. But Yasmin didn't waste words on ambiguity. She was telling me that she'd noticed what he was trying to understand, and that she'd decided I should know that she'd noticed. I drank from the skin, tasting the mineral edge of the well. "Let's move in an hour." The crew broke camp with the same efficiency they'd brought to every stop. I moved through it like I was reading a map they'd all learned to navigate without instructions. Rayhan's decision on the ox came back as a nod. The horse would ride in another wagon, no abandonment needed. The harnesses were checked. The supplies redistributed with the kind of mathematical precision that only Lyra could have managed. Soren reported 2 hours ahead of schedule. His maps were marked with the kind of detail that suggested he wasn't just tracking the route, He was tracking what I would need to know before I needed to know it. Lyra secured the water containers herself, checking each seal twice. Her ledger was tucked against her ribs like it was part of her body. We were racing the day. That was what the clean efficiency meant. That was what it meant when a crew followed you not because you were strong or clever, but because you respected the one thing they couldn't get back. The evening came fast in the ash waste. By the time we stopped to camp, the heat had broken enough to let people breathe again. The crew set up in the order they'd learned, each person moving to their station without being told. Ryan checked the horses one more time. Lyra secured the supplies. Soren marked the maps for the next day's route. And I went to my tent with the ledger. The pages were spread out in front of me when Darian appeared in the opening. He didn't intrude. He just arrived, the way he did with most things now, present but not assuming inclusion. I didn't hide the ledger. Do you know anything about trade books? Records? He moved closer, studying the pages with the kind of focus that suggested he was reading more than just the numbers. His eyes settled on the discrepancy I'd marked in the margin. This one, he said, pointing. Where was it supposed to go? That's the question I can't answer, and I need to. Because Bahram didn't write in code, and he didn't lose things. I spread the pages wider, showing him the pattern. 2 cases of amberlace listed as sold. No destination. No recipient. No follow-up ledger entry on the receiving end. Just a gap, as if someone had stepped over that line and pretended it didn't exist. The volume? I said, running my finger along the entry. Look at the volume. Bahram's normal sales were measured. 2 or 3 cases at a time. These 2 cases are logged the same way as everything else, but the quantity is inconsistent with the destination pattern. There's no merchant house in the ash waste that takes amberlace in those volumes unless they're not using it for trade. I flipped to an earlier page, showed him the pattern of Bahram's legitimate sales. Small quantities. Marked destinations. Payment recorded and follow-up notation made. Each one traced like a thread through the ledger. Amberlace is expensive. It's not something you buy in bulk unless you're a council house buyer or you're supplying an institution. Bahram never did council house work. He said it made him uncomfortable. So when 2 cases disappear into a gap with no destination, no recipient, no follow-up, I let the implication hang. Darian studied it in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had that surgical quality he used when he was trying to map something he didn't fully understand yet. Someone was moving it for someone else, he said. Not a question. Someone who had leverage over him, or enough gold that he decided the risk was worth the silence. Council-level someone, or close to it. Bahram wouldn't have made that kind of deal without leverage, and he wouldn't have left a record of it unless he was trying to keep insurance. I sat back from the ledger. It was accurate enough to make something in my chest tighten. In the weeks after Bahram's death, I'd moved through the paperwork like it was negotiable. Like the ledger was just another client to manage. But the truth was simpler and worse. I was afraid of standing in front of Khurram with incomplete answers. I was afraid of the moment someone asked me a question and discovered I didn't have the information to cover it. Khurram gave us 30 days before moving on the license, I said. That was when we started at Suhari. Now I'm burning days waiting for answers I don't have. I can't afford that. The caravan can't afford that. So you move. I move, I decide, I negotiate, all from the position of knowing exactly where I stand and when I need to be somewhere else. I don't waste time waiting for clarity. I act with what I have and course correct after. It was the operating principle of independent merchants who wanted to stay independent. Delay them, and their competitors closed in. Make them wait, and their options evaporated. I had learned this over a decade of moving goods across the ash waste. I had learned it by watching Bahram never learn it at all. "So Tal-Veshaan isn't just a resupply," Darian said. "It's a test of whether anyone can slow you down. It's a stop on the road. Everything else is negotiable." He didn't push. He just nodded like he understood what that really meant. That the oasis ahead wasn't just a waystation. It was the first place since Suhari where someone had power over the caravan. It was the first negotiation that wouldn't happen from a position of absolute control. It was the test I'd been anticipating since Yasmin had mentioned Hassoun's name. I closed the ledger. The discrepancy would still be there tomorrow and the day after. But I couldn't answer it from a position of strength here. I had to move. I had to reach Tal-Veshaan and find out what Hassoun was willing to tell me about a man who'd been dead for months and still casting shadows across every decision I made. Darian turned to go. "Thank you for asking," I said. He paused in the tent opening. "For what?" "For asking what you actually meant instead of accepting the first answer." He smiled, brief and genuine. "Someone taught me that." He left. I sat with the ledger as the camp settled around me. The crew was already bedding down. Soren was checking the night watch schedule. Rayhan was making sure the horses were settled for the dark hours. Yasmin was doing whatever Yasmin did when she thought no one was watching, which usually involved checking my tent from a distance to make sure I wasn't spiraling. Tomorrow, we reached Tal-Veshaan. Tomorrow I would meet Hassoun and begin the negotiation that would either prove I could lead this caravan or expose me as the widow playing at business while the men decided what actually mattered. I had 2 cases of amberless sitting in sealed containers downstairs, a ledger full of questions I couldn't answer, and a principle that had snapped into place over the past hour, clean and unbreakable. I don't negotiate with time. I negotiate with goods. That was my answer. That was the only answer that mattered. I folded the ledger closed and sat in the quiet of the tent, listening to the camp settle. In the distance, Soren was marking something on the maps. The water was secure. The crew was steady. The amberless was locked and ready. Everything I needed to walk into the oasis with the kind of certainty that would tell Hassoun I wasn't a widow looking for protection. I was a merchant with goods to trade and a schedule that would not be moved. Tomorrow I would prove it. Chapter 3. Gate of Courtesy. The caravan crested the ridge just as the light began to shift. For a moment, we were suspended between the hard glare of afternoon and the approach of evening, that brief window where the ash waste became almost bearable. Below us, the desert opened into a sudden scar of green. Tal-Veshaan. It was smaller than I'd expected, or perhaps the desert had simply made me forget how to read distance. The oasis resolved itself into discrete parts: twin wells at the north face, stone structures arranged in deliberate patterns, the dark shadow of covered arcades cutting across what I could already tell would be the bazaar quarter. A perimeter wall ran the full circuit, gated at 4 cardinal points. Inside, the caravanserai occupied its own square, built the way such places always were, a defensive interior courtyard with the merchant quarters set inward, the animals kept separate, everything metered through controlled passages. It was efficient. That was the first thing that struck me about it. Not grand. Not ornate. Efficient in the way only a place built by someone who understood leverage could be efficient. "There it is," Soren said. His voice carried the satisfaction of a navigator who had read the stone channels correctly. 2 hours if we push? 2 hours meant arriving as the heat was beginning to break, that precise window where the crew would be too tired to do anything but settle. 2 hours meant Hassoun could greet us on his schedule, not ours. The crew took the news without complaint. These were people who had learned, over 3 days on the road, to trust the rhythm of the caravan and the competence of the woman leading it. Yasmin appeared beside me as we began the descent toward the walled perimeter. Her expression settled into the neutral regard she always wore when reading a new place. "Place has changed hands 3 times in the last decade," she said. It was not a question or a warning. It was the kind of remark that came from someone who had been watching the caravan routes longer than most merchants stayed in business. Whoever's running it now, they're efficient. I'd already clocked that much from the ridge. What I hadn't clocked yet was why efficiency mattered in a waystation. Waystations were supposed to be simple: water, repairs, supplies, passage. But Tal-Veshaan read differently. Every structure I could see had been placed with the precision of someone calculating leverage down to the individual detail. The approach took exactly 2 hours. By the time we reached the gate, the light was beginning to shift toward amber, that brief window where everything cast long shadows and looked like it mattered. The watchers at the gate were polite about the halt, not threatening, just present, watching as we approached with the careful attention of people who had seen enough caravans to understand the difference between a routine merchant and someone carrying valuable cargo. I kept Darian in the middle wagon. He rode with his head down, doing the thing he'd learned to do after 3 days with the crew: be present without assuming inclusion. The watchers would note a mage. Better, they noted one that didn't command immediate attention. The gate swung open. Inside the caravanserai, the settling was methodical and cramped. The courtyard sprawled larger than I'd anticipated from the ridge, but the crew's lodgings revealed their design immediately. 3 rooms to a corridor, merchant-class housing, stacked tight as cargo. I watched Lyra cross the threshold to her assigned space, her tall frame nearly scraping the stone archway. She straightened inside, looked at the narrow bed and narrower water closet, and let out a low curse that carried further than she probably intended. This wasn't rest. This was warehousing, the kind of temporary storage designed to move people through as efficiently as goods. The water situation became clear within minutes. 1 brass tap per corridor, timed usage posted on the wall in precise notations. Morning draws before the sun rose. Midday ration for animal care. Evening draws by written request only. Breakfast was communal in the hall. Every shower, every toilet stop, every moment of privacy had been calculated and constrained by the layout of the place. I moved through the corridors as the crew distributed themselves. Raihan was already coordinating with Soren over the horse arrangements, both of them noting the limited stable capacity with the kind of resigned precision that came from knowing what the limitations would cost us. The repair shops faced north, visible from the administrative building at the courtyard's head. Nothing happened here that wasn't observed. Nothing was left to chance. Yasmin found me in the second corridor, her expression already carrying the weight of her assessment. "Water rationing's written into the schedule," she said quietly. "Morning draw for human use, midday for animals. Evening draw requires written request. They're metering it at the source, not the outcome. Anyone who pushes will get noted. I'd have seen it myself in another hour. But Yasmin's speed in clocking it meant she was running the same numbers I was: limited water, limited repair capacity, limited time if anyone wanted animals rested properly before the push across the next stretch of desert. Every constraint layered on top of the others, and simple survival required patience, and patience was what Hassoun intended to charge for. "Everything's designed to push merchants through," she continued, keeping her voice low even though the corridor was empty. "Not by force. By physics. By structure. By making the alternative to cooperation exhausting." She was right. Everything in Tal-Veshaan had been arranged to create friction. Not violence. The watchers at the gate had been courteous. But friction nonetheless. The kind that accumulated over days, wore at patience, made people willing to negotiate away margins just to accelerate departure. Hassoun arrived as the crew was settling into their assigned spaces. He was mid-50s, moving with the kind of controlled precision that suggested he'd spent decades managing the exact moment when courtesy became leverage. His greeting was warm, genuinely so, which was the part that made it effective. He welcomed us by name. He offered water personally, carrying the first pitcher himself, and pouring it into my hands with a care that suggested the gesture mattered. His fingers were dry, his nails precisely trimmed. Everything about him spoke of institutional care, institutional precision. "The road is unkind," he said, his eyes settling on me with the attentiveness of someone calculating several things at once. "Your crew is well established in the merchant quarter. Rooms for your second, chambers for yourself, the best we have. The wells are reliable, though busy at morning hours. I'd suggest drawing water after sunset for your animal's evening ration. The main courtyard can be loud if you're accustomed to quiet rest." He gestured toward the courtyard, casual, unhurried, his fingers steepled with the kind of comfort that came from absolute authority. Thin smile. "We take pride in our guests' comfort within the constraints of the waystation format." "I appreciate the guidance," I said carefully. "Of course, a full structural assessment of your wagons takes time. 3 days at minimum, often longer. The desert is harder on wood than merchants expect. We've developed a process, thorough, yes, but it protects your investment. I've been managing this facility for 7 years now. In that time, I've yet to have a merchant dispute my repair assessments." There it was. Not a threat. Just a statement of fact wrapped in reassurance. But the fact was a delay, and the delay was a price, and he deployed both while handing me water with his own hands, before the crew had even finished untying the wagon covers. 7 years. Long enough to have refined the system. Long enough to have broken in every merchant who'd pushed back. My breath caught, though nothing in my face moved. It was the sort of shift only someone watching for it would catch. And I was watching, clocking not just what he'd said, but the precision of how he'd said it. This wasn't a request. This was a system. And he'd built it into the bones of the place so thoroughly that resisting it would mean resisting the simple physics of Tal-Veshaan itself. "But we'll discuss particulars after you've rested," Hassoun said, his smile warming by a calculated degree. "The journey has been long. We'll want to settle your people. I'll send refreshment to your quarters, dates, cheese, wine if you prefer. We stock several varieties." I accepted with the nod that meant I understood the compliment without reading it as charity. I watched him as he moved toward the caravanserai entrance, gesturing for the crew to distribute themselves among the available rooms. Darian was absorbed into the merchant quarter without my having to ask. Soren oversaw wagon placement. Yasmin had already begun taking inventory of the supplies, water sources, well access, the general shape of resupply. That left me standing in the courtyard of Tal-Veshaan, my crew settling into their cramped, metered spaces, watching a system that had been designed by someone who understood that time was the currency no merchant could earn back. My quarters overlooked both the internal courtyard and the well access points. I stood at the window as the crew dispersed, studying the layout with the precision that had become habit. Everything in Tal-Veshaan could be accessed through controlled passages. The wells were metered. The repair shops answered to whoever controlled the gates. The barrel storage was limited, forcing merchants to negotiate resupply on schedule rather than at their own pace. The drafthouse housing was inadequate for large caravans, which meant an extra day of negotiation over equipment rental just to have animals rest properly. The refreshment arrived promptly: dates, cheese, a wine that was better than I'd expected. Whoever planned Hassoun's hospitality understood that small comforts were more disarming than grand ones. Yasmin appeared in the doorway as I was running the calculations. "Place is a tax trap dressed as hospitality," she said. "Worse," I said. "It's efficient." Whoever designed this understood that time is the commodity. Delay a caravan 3 extra days, and they'll pay anything to move on. You don't need to threaten them. You just need to slow them down. I turned from the window to look at her. This is exactly what quorum would pay for. A mechanism to slow independent merchants while letting allied parties close on them in the open desert. Yasmin's expression didn't change, but there was something in her bearing that shifted, the recognition of a woman who had just heard confirmation of something she'd been suspecting since we crested the ridge. Tomorrow he'll ask about the cargo, I said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow, Yasmin agreed, he'll ask about the amberless. The crew was settling into the caravanserai proper, their voices carrying through the stone corridors in the way crew voices always did when there was finally rest in sight. I could hear Rayhan checking the horse assignments, Lyra verifying the water allocations, Soren marking something on the maps. But my mind was already moving ahead. Hassoun had shown me his system in a single breath of courtesy. What he'd shown me was not kindness. It was design. And I had spent a decade learning to read the design of trade, learning to see the pressure points before they became problems. The evening settled over Tal-Veshaan, and I sat with that clarity. Tomorrow I would be called to his office. Tomorrow I would learn what the Trade Council wanted from a widow with amberless and a deadline. Tomorrow the negotiation would begin in earnest. But tonight, I simply read the space. Below, in the courtyard, I could see the last of the evening activity. Soren verifying wagon locks. Lyra and Rayhan coiling rope with practiced efficiency. The crew had learned over 3 days to trust that I would get them out. Now they'd learned something else. That getting out required understanding what was holding you in. Hassoun's information offer echoed in my mind. Guides. Local intelligence. Water conditions. All of it commodified. All of it priced in days and negotiation and the slow mechanical squeeze of a system designed to extract maximum value from every merchant who passed through. I understood now why Yasmin had looked at this place with such focus. Why she'd been running the calculations before I had. She'd seen this mechanism before, in other forms, and she'd recognized it immediately. A system that turned necessity into commerce, and commerce into control. The Trade Council's fingerprints were all over it. I turned back to the window and watched the twin moons rising over the desert's edge. Chapter 4. The Demand. His office was on the western side of the compound, positioned to catch the morning light. I noticed that as soon as I entered, the way the windows had been set to command a view of both the bazaar entrance and the inner courtyard. Everything about Tal-Veshaan's architecture was a language. Hassoun's office was fluent. He rose when I entered, courtesy still intact but something else beneath it now. The warmth had solidified into formality. This was a man shifting from host to contractor. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across his desk. "I wanted to speak with you privately before we move forward with resupply." I sat. The chair was deliberately placed lower than his. Hassoun settled back, his fingers steepled. "Your caravan carries valuable cargo. Amberless, I'm told, along with the usual merchant goods. The privilege of passage through contested territory requires certain acknowledgments." I said nothing. Waited. "We maintain these facilities for the benefit of the trade routes," he continued, his voice carrying the precision of rehearsed language. "The wells, the storage, the repair capacity, all of it exists to serve caravans like yours. And the maintenance of that infrastructure, the security of this location, requires contribution." He slid a paper across the desk toward me. Figures written in a careful hand. 3 cases of amberless. The calculation was precise, not so much that refusing would seem reasonable, but enough to sting. That is our assessment of appropriate tribute for the privilege of passage and the resources you'll consume during your stay, Hassoun said. Standard for caravans of your size and cargo value. I read the paper once, then looked at him. And the timeline? A thorough structural assessment of your wagons takes time. The desert is harder on wood than merchants expect. I would recommend a full 2 weeks for repairs and resupply coordination. Standard for caravans of your size. There it was. Not a request. A system laid out in courteous language that was not courteous at all. A 2-week delay is not standard, I said. It's leverage. Hassoun didn't flinch. He shifted slightly in his chair, and I watched the motion. It was a tell, the smallest correction toward something. He'd been leaning forward, I realized. The shift backward was retreat. Not physical fear. Acknowledgement that I'd named the thing he was doing. The desert moves faster than schedules, he said, reaching for his water glass as a pause. His hand was steady, but the reach was a stall. He drank, watching me over the rim. Extended stays ensure you depart safely. The liability if a caravan leaves inadequately prepared. Adequately prepared according to whom? According to someone who has seen what the ash waste does to merchants who underestimate it. Everything in me narrowed. Not a movement he could see, my hands stayed where they were, my expression held, but a gathering inward, a sharpening. I was clocking something that had been bothering me since Hassoun opened his mouth. Contested territory. Privilege of passage. Maintenance of infrastructure. These were not a waystation master's words. These were council language. I'd heard variations of it before, from merchants who'd dealt with council contractors, from traders who'd learned to recognize institutional control when it moved in courtesy's clothing. What I noticed next was Hassoun's breathing. It had shifted when I narrowed, faster, shallower. He'd seen me see him. And he knew that I knew he knew. The man across from me wasn't deciding whether to drop the pretense. He was deciding whether the pretense still mattered. What happens if I refuse the delay? I asked. The risks would be significant. Wagon repairs incomplete, water stores insufficient, crew unprepared for the next segment. I would strongly advise against departure before assessment is complete. He never said you can't leave. He didn't need to. And what struck me then, watching him, was the precision of his refusal to threaten. A council contractor wouldn't threaten. He'd establish facts and let facts do the coercion. It was cleaner. Less deniable. I'll consider your proposal, I said, and rose. I appreciate your clarity. Of course, Hassoun said, rising with me, a courtesy and also a calculation. Standing meant we were equals again, at least in the geometry of the room. Take the time you need to consult with your crew. But I would appreciate an answer by sunset tomorrow. The assessment begins as soon as we reach agreement. I nodded and left, his office dissolving behind me as I moved toward the courtyard. But I was already 3 steps ahead of the courtesy. I was already reading his calculation and the question behind it. Did she clock the council fingerprint? The answer was yes. And by sunset tomorrow, Hassoun would know that I knew. I could feel it in the air between us, that shift where a negotiation stops being courteous and becomes something else. A test. A boundary. A moment where one side discovers the other side can read, and adjusts their strategy accordingly. By the time I reached the caravanserai courtyard, I'd already begun to map the paths. What Hassoun's next move would be if he accepted. What he'd say if he refused. The places where Darian's presence would register as a pressure. The spaces where I could move if things escalated. I was ready for any of it. My quarters felt smaller with 4 people inside them. Yasmin was already seated when Soren and Rayhan arrived, having pulled them from their afternoon tasks. I closed the door and laid out the terms plainly. 3 cases of amberless as tribute, I said. 2 weeks for assessment and resupply. Soren's jaw tightened immediately. That's council work. No independent contractor moves a demand structured like that. The language alone is council language, Yasmin said. Not a question. She was reading me as she spoke, the way she read every space we entered. But there's something else. You wouldn't call us here unless you'd already made a decision. I held her gaze for a moment. She knew me well enough to know my stillness. Worse, Rayhan said, pacing toward the window. 2 weeks in the desert after Tal-Veshaan means Coram has time to position. We'd arrive at the burning passage exposed, and he'd know exactly when we were coming. That's not a coincidence. That's coordination. The cases are acceptable, Yasmin said quietly. A gift to a waystation master. Reasonable overhead. The delay is death. Lyra had been quiet until now, standing by the door. She was the youngest of the crew, but I'd learned her silences meant she was working through something. He's testing us, she said. It wasn't a question. To see what we'll accept. Yes, I said. And once we accept delay, we accept his timeline. We accept that he controls when we move. That's not just time we're losing. That's autonomy. There was something in the room then, a recognition that none of them had chosen this caravan out of desperation. They'd chosen it because I'd built something that mattered. And they weren't about to watch me trade that away to a waystation master in an oasis. Soren crossed his arms. So what's the counter? I'm going to refuse the delay, I said. We'll offer the cases and propose 3 days for resupply. If Hassoun won't accept 3 days, we'll move without his blessing. He controls the well access, Rayhan said. Her voice steady but concerned. Without water, we carry enough to reach the next station if we ration. It won't be comfortable, but it's possible. And it's better than giving them the time they want. The crew won't like moving on contested territory without a waystation seal, Soren said. He wasn't arguing against the decision. He was laying out the cost. The crew will trust me if I ask them to, I said. They've learned that in the last 3 days. The 3 of them exchanged looks, not happy, but trusting. That was the thing I'd built over a decade of command and 3 days of deliberate leadership. A crew that would walk into risk with me because they'd learned my calculations didn't come from panic. My refusals were precision work. Tomorrow morning, I'll send word that I want to discuss alternatives, I said. By sunset, we'll have his response. Either he accepts 3 days in the cases, or we move without him. And if he escalates, Lyra asked. It was the right question. Then we make it clear that escalation doesn't change the calculation. He can have 3 cases in 3 days, or he can have a problem. He doesn't know what a problem looks like yet. Yasmin's expression didn't change, but there was something in her bearing that shifted. Approval, maybe. Or recognition. She'd spent more than a decade watching from a safer distance. Now she was watching from inside my choice. Darian was waiting when Yasmin and the others left. He'd been outside the door, patient in that way of his, never pushing. I told him directly what I'd told them. The demand, the 2 weeks, the terms I would refuse. Tomorrow I'm going to bring you to the negotiation, I said. Hassoun doesn't know what you are yet, but he suspects. I want him to see you beside me as part of the caravan's structure, not hidden cargo. To intimidate? Darian's voice was careful. To make the calculation clear. He can have 3 cases in 3 days, or he can have a problem. I'm not threatening violence. I'm showing him that he doesn't have all the information he thinks he has." Darian's expression was unreadable. "All right. Don't show your hand. Don't use resonance. Just be visible. Let him read the threat in the fact of your presence." "I understand," Darian said. I nodded. That was the thing about having him aboard. He understood the work without needing explanation. He understood that visibility was a weapon when deployed right. Evening came to Tal-Veshaan in shades of amber and rust. I stood at my window alone, the bizarre noise fading beneath the stone. The calculation was clear now, but that didn't make it smaller. If I accepted the 2-week delay, I was surrendering something more valuable than 2 weeks of time. I was teaching Hassoun, and through him, anyone who served the council, that the Vasrin caravan could be controlled by making it wait. I was teaching them that my timeline was negotiable. I moved to the edge of the window, leaning against the stone frame, and let myself feel the weight of the choice. It was substantial. A 2-week delay seemed reasonable to a crew that had traveled the ash waste for 3 days. Comfort and safety felt like words with meaning. But I understood what they actually meant. You are not autonomous. Your movement is conditional. Your authority is subject to approval. I'd spent a decade invisible behind Bahram's front, watching from 3 wagons back while he stood at the lead and performed ownership. I'd won the right to lead openly at the cost of taking on everything that came with that. My crew's safety. My caravan's reputation. My own authority. If I gave that to Hassoun now, it was the beginning of giving it away everywhere. There was a choice being made, but not in the way choices usually felt. It wasn't a moment of decision. It was a moment of recognition. The decision had been made the instant Hassoun shifted into his corporate voice. The instant I clocked council language. I could delay and appear cooperative. I could keep the moment quiet, avoid conflict, protect myself from the unknown. Or I could assert my timeline and accept the cost of being seen as someone who would not bend. I thought of the first run out of Khazar Karam after Bahram died. The caravan had moved because I had made it move. Not because anyone authorized it. Not because the route gave permission. I had taken that weight up openly then, and I had carried it since, and I was not going to set it down now for a waystation master in an oasis. By refusing the delay, I was saying something plain. You do not control when I move. I turned from the window and stood in the center of my quarters, in the gathering dark. The lights from the bazaar were beginning to emerge below, small points of warmth in the stone. I could hear my crew, somewhere in the compound, settling into the evening. Soren checking maps. Yasmin counting water rations. Lyra repairing something that had come loose on the wagon. And I stood still. In that stillness, I knew exactly what I was risking. I knew exactly what I was protecting. I knew that tomorrow would bring either agreement or escalation, and either way, I was stepping beyond the point of compromise. The decision was final before I knew I'd made it. Tomorrow, I would meet Hassoun again. I would present the counteroffer. 3 cases, 3 days, dawn departure. If he refused, we would move without his blessing. We would move on my terms, into contested territory, with whatever consequences that carried. And I was ready. Chapter 5. The Tell. The Cistern complex entrance was carved into the northern wall of the caravanserai compound, a stone mouth opening into cool dark. Yasmin had mentioned it in passing. Water assessment takes precision, and the old cistern system runs deep. I'd accepted the excuse without hesitation. It was the kind of thing a caravan master would do. Take inventory of what was available, calculate reserves, understand the limits of the station's capacity. It was also the kind of thing that got me alone, underground, away from Hassoun's calculated courtesy and the crew's carefully neutral faces. Darian had asked to come with me. Just that, a question, not a demand. I'd allowed it because refusing would have required explanation, and I was too tired to explain why I needed to hear stone instead of voices. The descent was steep at first, broad steps cut smooth by a century of water traffic. The air thickened as we moved deeper, went from dusty heat to something thick and mineral-heavy. I could smell it before I could feel it, water somewhere below, and the particular coolness that comes from stone this deep in the earth. Somewhere in this structure, the station's survival depended on what flowed through channels too deep for the desert sun to touch. The first chamber opened up around us like a held breath. It was smaller than I expected, perhaps 30 feet across, the walls fitted stone, the floor slick with moisture. Channels ran along 3 sides, grooves cut into the stone to direct water flow. Most of the channels were dry now, just stone and shadow and the ghost of liquid passage. But in the center, a pool reflected lamplight back at me, dark and still. I crouched at the edge of it, my fingertips finding the cool of the stone rim. The pool was shallow, perhaps 3 feet across, maybe 2 feet deep. I could see the bottom, pale stone covered in a thin film of sediment. Water temperature would be constant this far down. Cold. Reliable. I ran my palm along the channel nearest me, calculating the volume this system could move in a single flush, the rate of water lost to evaporation versus absorption into the surrounding stone, the recovery time if the wells above were working optimally. "How long have you been running the numbers?" Darian's voice didn't echo the way I expected. The stone swallowed most of it, made it sound smaller, closer. "Since Hassoun decided I needed advice about desert practicality," I said. I straightened, turned to face him. In the lamplight, his features were all shadow and bone. "The caravan can carry enough to get us through the ash waste if we ration. Whether we ration depends on whether Hassoun gets his 2 weeks. And he won't." It wasn't a question. I appreciated that he didn't make it one. "He will not," I confirmed. I moved deeper into the chamber, my footsteps soft on the stone. There was a second passage leading from the far wall, another descent. The next chamber held most of the volume, if the architecture pattern held. I wanted to see the scope of what Tal-Veshaan actually controlled. "Do you know why I'm here?" "Really?" "Because you needed to see what he had," Darian said. "Because I need to know what I'm working with," I corrected. The terms he presented have the shape of institutional pressure. That means he's either reading from a script or someone gave him the script and told him to use it. Neither is comforting. But if I'm going to refuse him, I need to know whether he's bluffing about what this station can do to damage me. The stone channels were the architecture of power. Not swords or raised voices, just the cold mathematics of water and time. Control the supply, control the timeline. Delay a caravan, and you shaped everything that came after. We moved into the second chamber. It was larger, the lamplight barely reaching the far wall. The pool here was bigger, a proper reservoir, the water deeper and darker. I could see ripples from our movement above reflected below, an inversion of sky. The channels here were more complex, branching into multiple pathways. I crouched again, studying the patterns, the seals, the way the stone had been worked to direct flow from one chamber to the next. "This system was built for more than waystation use," I said quietly. "For volume. For water that moves caravans, not just the handful of guests who sleep upstairs. Which means Hassoun isn't running the station alone. This is someone else's infrastructure. He's just the administrator." "The council," Darian said. "The council?" I agreed. It settled something I'd only half suspected. Which means the 2-week delay isn't his negotiation. It's their requirement. He's not trying to control my timeline, he's been told to, and he's trying to do it gently. I stood, and for a moment I wasn't looking at the water anymore. I was thinking about 10 years of invisibility, of standing 3 wagons back and watching Bahram perform the role of owner while I did the actual work. I was thinking about the moment I'd decided I wouldn't do that anymore. I was thinking about what it meant to let someone else control when I moved. Why are you fighting him? Darian's voice was different now, not reading the situation, but asking something underneath it. Not the logistics. That's not why. I held myself perfectly still. Hands, breath, thought, all of it narrowed to a single bright point. Because I can't afford to lose 2 weeks, I said. That's the logistics. It's also true. Yes, Darian agreed, and I heard the patience in his voice, the kind of patience that came from someone who knew how to wait. But it's not the actual reason. I could have deflected. Should have. I could have made it a matter of practical necessity, merchant sense, caravan efficiency. But he was already seeing me clearly. I'd known that since the moment he followed me down into this stone throat. And I was tired of performing, tired of translating myself into something smaller and more convenient. Delay means vulnerability, I said. My voice echoed off the stone, came back to me slightly distorted. It means exposure. It means that someone else controls when I move, and once you let someone else control that, everything after falls apart. You're visible only when they allow visibility. You move only when they permit movement. You exist only in the margins of their schedule. Are you afraid of him? Darian asked. No, I said. And the word came out sharper than intended. I'm afraid of time. Of giving time away to people who understand its value only as a weapon. The moment hung between us. I could feel Darian's attention, the weight of his presence in the small space. But he didn't move closer. He didn't press. He just waited. I can feel what stone wants, he said quietly. The words came carefully, like he was testing them in the cool air. What it's holding, what it remembers. If the structure is compromised, I can sense it. If you need to know what's underneath courtesy, I can read it. I turned to look at him properly. You mean you could stabilize something if it breaks? I could, he said. But I wasn't offering that. What were you offering? The ability to know what's underneath. To understand the actual capacity and the actual risk. Not power, he said. Knowledge? Permission to stop pretending that Hassoun's estimate of your vulnerability is accurate. His restraint impressed me more than any offer of force would have. He was making himself available without pushing himself into the negotiation, offering competence instead of control. That was rarer than I wanted to admit. Nara! Yasmin's voice came down the descent, carried by the stone in ways that made it sound both far and immediate. Water levels confirmed. Chambers 2 and 3 are full. The system is currently at optimal capacity. The moment broke. Real life returned. Crew business, practical concerns, the weight of command settling back onto my shoulders. But something had shifted in the cistern, something that would carry forward into tomorrow. Darian and I exchanged a look, not a smile, not even agreement exactly. Just recognition. We emerged from the cistern complex back into the fading afternoon heat of Tal-Veshaan's courtyard. The sun was moving toward the western walls, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The stone around us held the heat like a memory, and I could feel the dust settling on my skin, the transition from cool dark to desert burn. Rest today, I said to Darian as we walked toward the quarters. Tomorrow you come to the negotiation. He nodded. You want me visible. I want him to understand that you're part of the caravan structure, I said. Not hidden passenger. Not cargo. Part of what I'm offering to take into the desert. I understand, Darian said. That was the thing about having him aboard. I could make the decisions and he would understand the work. I didn't have to explain strategy to someone who could read the actual stakes underneath the performance. Evening came to my quarters. I lay on the sleeping mat, the lamp burning low, and I didn't sleep. But I wasn't restless either. I was running through tomorrow the way a caravan master would. The counter-offer structured, the terms established, the crew briefed and ready. Asmin understood the stakes. Soren would back the play. Ryan had calculated the logistics of moving without the full 2-week resupply and determined it was survivable. 3 cases of amberless, 3 days for resupply, dawn departure. If Hassoun refused, we moved anyway. Darian would stand beside me when I presented it. His tremor wasn't visible at rest, but Hassoun would know what a mage looked like once the pattern registered. That was all I needed him to do, be visible and competent and present enough that the council contractor would have to recalculate his leverage. I thought about the cistern, the way the stone had held us both and made the ordinary business of fear sound clear and precise. The way Darian had offered knowledge instead of force. The way he'd asked the actual question underneath all the logistics. Are you afraid? My fear hadn't gone away, but it had been contextualized now. I wasn't afraid of Hassoun. I wasn't afraid of the desert or the ash waste or the trade routes ahead of us. I was afraid of giving up my own timeline, and that was a fear I could carry and work around and protect myself from. It was a fear that belonged to me, not something to be solved. By the time the first light touched the windows of Tal-Veshaan, I wasn't rested, but I was resolved. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I knew exactly what I was willing to lose and what I would defend to the end. Tomorrow, I would walk into Hassoun's office and I would tell him the terms. And if he refused them, we would leave Tal-Veshaan on our own schedule, not on his. The fear stayed with me, tight in my chest, present in the quiet parts of my breath. But it was mine. And that made all the difference. Chapter 6. The Fracture. The tent walls were thin. I'd known this when I'd chosen my quarters, not chosen exactly. Accepted. The caravanserai's guest section offered a row of standard canvas structures, all of them identical, all of them cheap enough that they rattled in the wind and let every sound through. I'd taken the one nearest the storage yard because I needed proximity to the water assessment, needed to move between courtyard and quarters without crossing the full compound. Trade efficiency, nothing more. But lying in the dark 2 hours past midnight, listening to the fabric breathe, I was aware of proximity in a different way. Darian's tent was on the adjacent wall. I could hear him through the canvas, the shift of his sleeping mat, the settling of his weight, the small sounds a person makes when they're trying to find comfort in a place that doesn't offer it. We weren't separated by much. Thin cloth and the distance of maybe 10 feet, nothing in the architecture, nothing but opportunity for sound to carry both ways. I wasn't quite asleep. The negotiation was still running through my head, loops of counteroffer and contingency, the shape of tomorrow's conversation taking form in the dark. I decided on the terms an hour ago. 3 cases, 3 days. But the weight of them hadn't settled. Every decision meant something, and Hassoun's smile meant that something was being measured and calculated against my weakness. That was when the sound came. Not loud. Just a voice, rough with sleep and something else, something like drowning. A single word, sharp and anguished. Farzad. It cut off like breaking glass. Everything in me stopped. Not the small stillness of listening more carefully. The complete kind, body arrested mid-breath, thought narrowed to a single point of attention. There was nothing in that name except the rawness of it, the way it came out of his throat like something being torn. Then again, fainter, less formed. Farzad, I. And then silence so complete it sounded like drowning. Like someone had gone under mid-sentence, and the water had closed over the words. The tent was quiet. Not the quiet of sleep. The quiet of an absence, a negative space. I could feel Darian on the other side of the fabric, and I could feel him not moving, not crying out again. Just silent. My heartbeat was fast. I could feel it in my chest, in my neck, in the base of my throat. I was lying on my sleeping mat, lamp already extinguished, and I was listening into darkness that had a name in it now, a name I didn't understand, and the weight of not understanding felt like a physical thing. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time did strange things in the dark, stretched and contracted depending on attention. I lay motionless, my eyes open, my ears tracking every sound that came through the canvas. Waiting for the name again. Waiting for the cry. Waiting for something that would tell me what I was listening to. Grief or guilt or terror or some combination I didn't have words for. It didn't come. That was worse than the cry. The silence that followed was worse than the sound because silence meant he was listening too, aware that he had been heard, calculating what would come next. I could imagine him lying on his own mat, tremor still and careful, understanding that somewhere beyond the canvas, someone had heard him break. The absence of a second cry was its own kind of agony. I held it in my hands in the dark and couldn't put it down. By the time the first light touched the edges of the tent, I hadn't slept. But I had made a decision. The kind of decision that came from lying still long enough to understand what I was holding and why, and what it would cost to let someone else use it against him. I could use the name. Could corner him about it, force him to explain, leverage the guilt into cooperation. Could make his vulnerability into a tool. People did that. People did that constantly. I didn't. The morning courtyard was already active when I emerged. Yasmin was checking the water casks, marking levels on the storage ledger. Soren was oiling the wagon hinges, the kind of preventative work that happened between stations. Raihan was reviewing the merchant rolls, calculating supplies. The crew moved around the space with the efficiency of people who had done this together 100 times. Darian came out of the guest quarters as I was passing the well. He looked like someone who hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, the skin underneath dark. He moved carefully, like the world was too sharp or too bright, and every motion took intention. He was armored already, his expression neutral, his posture controlled. But there was a brittleness to it, a sense of something held together with no margin for error. He didn't know I'd heard. That was important. The way he glanced at me was cautious but not vulnerable, the caution of someone who was re-establishing equilibrium, not the exposure of someone caught in the act of breaking. I could use that. I could let him not know I knew. I handed him a water skin as he passed. Drink. You'll need it for clarity today. He took it without comment, pulled the stopper, drank. His hands were steady. Good. Eat something before the negotiation, I said. The words were ordinary, the tone matter of fact. The kind of thing a caravan master says to crew who are underperforming. Not the camp bread. The dried fruit. Your body needs fuel more than it needs punishment. He nodded, and something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, but a recognition. A brief lowering of the armor. I'm ready, he said. I know, I said. That's why you come to the negotiation? Be visible. Let him see that you're part of the caravan structure. Not hidden. Not cargo. Part of what I'm moving. Yasmin called over from the water assessment. You two are quiet this morning. Preparing for negotiation, I said without turning. The words were light, unconcerned. Just crew business, nothing underneath. But I felt Darian's attention shift. He was listening for what was unsaid, and I was providing nothing except the absence of question. That was the gift, the choice not to ask. The choice to let him keep his secrets if he wanted them. I could have weaponized his guilt. Instead, I was honoring it by not using it. Whether he understood that or not wasn't my concern. Whether it mattered or not, I wasn't going to measure. Midday found me in my quarters, the ledger open in front of me. I wasn't supposed to be thinking about the negotiation yet. The strategy was set, the counter-offer decided. 3 cases, 3 days. If Hassoun refused, we moved anyway. The crew was ready. The terms were clear. There was nothing left but execution. I sat with the ledger anyway, watching my own hand move the stylus across the margin in small letters. Farzad. The word looked foreign in my own script. Small, careful, barely there. I didn't know who this person was. Didn't know if they were alive or dead, if the name was a confession or an accusation or a memory. Didn't know what Darian had done or failed to do or been forced to do. Didn't know any of it except that the name carried enough weight to drag him down in his sleep and make him cry it out into the dark. I drew a line through the letters, careful, not angry. Just erasing what I'd written. Trusting someone means accepting what you don't know about them. The realization came quietly, without drama. It settled into me the way understanding does, after a long time of listening. If I was going to stand beside Darian in a negotiation, if I was going to let him into the caravan, if I was going to accept his competence, and his restraint and his willingness to offer knowledge instead of force, then I had to accept also that there were parts of him I would never fully understand. Secrets he would keep or eventually tell or carry to his grave. Wounds that belonged to him alone. The ledger was blank again. That knowledge, the name and what it meant to him and the fact that I knew it, that stayed with me. Not on record. Not used. Just held, the way you hold something precious that someone else doesn't know you have. I closed the ledger. Evening came, and the world narrowed down to one thing: readiness. I reviewed the counteroffer one final time. 3 cases of amberless, enough to satisfy his tribute quota and honor the council's standard fee. 3 days for resupply, enough to move the essential supplies, test the wells, prepare for the ash waste proper. Departure at dawn. No escort. No collateral. No crew member left behind as assurance of good faith. It was reasonable. It was firm. It was the kind of offer that said, I understand the pressure, and I am not interested in compromise. Darian appeared at my quarters door as the sun was moving into the western walls. He was composed now, the brittleness gone. Whatever had broken in the night had been repaired or buried, and what showed was the controlled exterior of someone ready for work. I'm ready, he said. You don't need to perform, I said. I was still reviewing the numbers, but I looked up to meet his eyes. Just stand there. Let him see you're part of the caravan structure. Let him understand that what I'm offering to take into the desert is something he can't separate or diminish. You're not cargo. You're crew. That's all he needs to know. He nodded slowly. I understand. Good, I said. Then we go in together. We walked to Hassoun's office as afternoon became evening, and the weight of the day settled around us, all the things unsaid between us, all the things I was choosing not to ask, all the trust that was forming in the spaces where I could have demanded an explanation and didn't. The nightmare had changed something. The silence had changed something. And we were moving forward with it between us now, unnamed but real, the first binding that would hold us together through everything that came after. That was the fracture, I understood, not the breaking. The fracture was the moment after, when something shattered becomes the place where new things grow if you're careful enough to hold it gently. We were being careful. That was enough. Chapter 7. The negotiation opens. Hassoun's office was rendered in pale limestone with narrow windows that let in the early light, enough to see detail without creating shadow. The furniture was simple. A wide desk carved from a dark wood that looked almost black, 2 chairs positioned at an angle so we weren't seated directly across, and shelves holding account ledgers in careful rows. A merchant's room. A man who managed detail without drama. Hassoun himself was waiting when we arrived, standing at the window with a cup of tea in his hand. He was older than I'd expected, not ancient, but in his mid-50s, with gray already at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd stood in many rooms exactly like this and made many men nervous. He didn't look nervous himself. He turned when we entered, and his eyes moved from me to Darian and back again, cataloging, processing. The kind of assessment a man makes when he's trying to understand the shape of the power structure he's facing. "Nara Vasrin," he said, and extended his hand with formal courtesy. "I hope the quarters were adequate. The oasis is not Zarindel, but we maintain reasonable standards." I took his hand. His grip was warm, controlled, no pressure underneath. "The quarters are fine. The Cistern access is excellent. That's what matters." He smiled, and there was genuine warmth in it. A negotiator who respected efficiency. "Shall we speak plainly then? I appreciate that in a woman who knows what she's come to do." "I prefer it," I said. We settled into the chairs, Darian remaining standing just behind me and to the left, close enough that his presence was felt, far enough that he wasn't looming. I'd positioned us carefully in those moments between the courtyard and the office. He wasn't cargo. He wasn't crew. He was something else, and I needed Hassoun to understand that without me having to explain it. Hassoun sat across from me, his tea still in hand, and laid out his position with the ease of a man who'd rehearsed this many times. "The Vasrin caravan represents a considerable burden on the waystation resources," he said. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. "The water draw, the resupply needs, the use of facilities. Tal-Veshaan is a trade node, not a rest stop. We accommodate merchants who honor the scale of their accommodation." "Understood," I said. "As such, I require 3 cases of amberless as tribute, a fair assessment of the value your caravan is extracting from this waystation. Additionally, I'll need a 2-week delay in your departure to allow resupply to proceed without pressure." He paused, sipping his tea as if he'd just suggested something perfectly reasonable. "This ensures that both the caravan and the waystation benefit from the arrangement." I let the silence sit. It was a good offer, generously framed, reasonable on its face, completely impossible to accept. The 2-week delay was the knife underneath. Hassoun wasn't asking for amberless because he needed it. He was asking for delay because someone somewhere had told him to make sure we didn't move quickly. "I see," I said finally. "And if I refuse the delay?" Hassoun set down his cup carefully. "I would hope you wouldn't. It would complicate things unnecessarily. The resources, water, repairs to the wagons, feed for the animals, take time to source appropriately. Rushing it would be poor for you." He didn't answer the question. He just implied consequences if I didn't cooperate. "You're being diplomatic," I said. The tone was conversational, but I was watching his face. Which means someone in the Trade Council's infrastructure has asked you to ensure we stay longer than we want to. Is that accurate? His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition. You're very direct. I'm efficient, I corrected. Directness is just honesty about the actual conversation we're having. The institutional conversation, not the polite one. The Council has expressed interest in stable resupply processes, Hassoun said carefully. Delaying the caravan allows for better resource management. It's not personal pressure. It's practical coordination. Except the Council isn't here, I said. You are. And you're the one who has to explain to someone if a merchant passes through your waystation on a schedule you couldn't control. That's the real weight in the delay request. Not the water or the resources. Hassoun set his cup down and folded his hands on the desk. You understand the pressures of a trade node. I understand them very well, I said. I understand that if I'm delayed 2 weeks, certain doors close. The ash waste doesn't wait for my convenience. The market windows don't shift because a council contractor requested stability. And I understand that you've been put in a position where you can't explain those realities upward without losing standing. I leaned forward slightly. So let me make you a real offer, not the polite one. Hassoun leaned back in his chair, studying me with fresh attention. Go on. I will provide 3 cases of amberless, full tribute. The quality is excellent. I will resupply the caravan in 3 days. On the morning of day 4, at dawn, we depart. No delay. No escort. No crew member left behind as assurance. Those are my terms. That doesn't address the Council's requirements, Hassoun said. Yes, it does, I replied. The Council's requirement is that you demonstrate you have leverage, that you can slow down merchants, manage the rhythm of the route, maintain control over the waystation's operational schedule. 3 days of controlled resupply, 3 cases of amberless, all officially recorded, that demonstrates exactly that. You can tell the Council you negotiated the merchant into a measured 3-day stay and extracted a full tribute. That's control. And the 2-week delay is something you couldn't hold if the merchant is determined enough, I said quietly. And I am determined. So the question you have to answer is holding the delay worth the cost of me moving anyway and generating an incident at your waystation? Is it worth the Council wondering why a merchant decided the risk was worth breaking your authority? I stood. Hassoun was quiet for a moment. You understand leverage. I understand survival, I said. Sit back down, he said. Please. I settled into the chair again, and Hassoun rose, moving to a cabinet behind his desk. He withdrew 2 cups of tea from a ceramic pot that had been kept warm on a low brazier. The steam carried notes of mint and something darker. He handed me 1 cup and settled across from me again. The 3 cases of amberless, he said. What's your assessment of quality? Excellent. Clear resin, deep color, no fractures or irregularities. It will move at premium rates in any market east of here. And the caravan's need for resupply? 3 days is genuinely adequate? It is, I said. We're efficient with water. The crew knows how to pace consumption. The animals need feed and light repair to the wagon's wheels, which your artificers can manage in that time frame. 3 days is not a negotiation with urgency. It's a realistic timeline. Hassoun sipped his tea. You've done this before. Many times, I said. Never in an oasis where the institutional pressure is quite this visible, but the basic mathematics don't change. A caravan has needs. A waystation has capacity. The negotiation is finding the point where both are satisfied. The council's concern is that merchants move too quickly through nodes, he said carefully. If every caravan passes in 2 days, the resupply infrastructure becomes irrelevant. Which is why you need to demonstrate you can manage the rhythm, I said. 3 days is a meaningful stay. It shows you have influence. That's leverage. He nodded slowly, but did not yet speak. He turned his cup between his palms and looked at me across it. You will understand, he said at last, that 3 days on my ledger is not the same as 3 days on the council's. The council reads the length of a stay. They do not read the caravan master's reasoning. If I settle for 3, the number looks thin. It looks thin until you explain why you permitted it, I said. Which requires an explanation I can put in writing. He set the cup down. If I am to honor 3 days, I will require something on my ledger that makes the shortness of the stay look like a commercial win rather than a merchant slipping my authority. You will sign a standing route preference notice. Tal-Veshaan as your named stop on the Amber route, next 2 seasons. If another waystation solicits you, they see my mark on your ledger first. That is what I will send upstream. I permitted a 3-day stay. I secured a 2-season preferred merchant arrangement with the Vasrin caravan with full tribute on signing. The weight of it sat between us. 2 seasons named at his gates was not a trivial concession. It meant I could not take the southern route through Suhari if the market opened that way. It meant any rival waystation master on the Amber route would know Hassoun held paper on me. It meant a visible, public commitment that would follow the caravan into every negotiation for a full year. It was a real cost, and it was a cost he could defend. 3 cases, 3 days, dawn departure on day 4, I said, and the preferred stop notice. And no crew member as escort, he added. None. Your passenger stays integrated with my team. Agreed. He inclined his head. I'll send word to the council that I secured a 2-season preferred merchant arrangement and full tribute. Behind me, I felt Darian's attention ease slightly. Hassoun rose and crossed to the cabinet beside his desk. The notice came out of it already printed on stiff merchant stock, a standing form, one of many. He set it in front of me with a small brass inkwell and a clean nib. The place for my mark was a single line at the base. The place for his seal was beside it. The places for the dates, the tribute amount, and the preferred merchant term were already filled in. He had printed the form before the negotiation began. I looked at him for one long beat. He held my gaze without apology. You thought you might extract it, I said. I thought I might try. I drew the inkwell closer, took the nib, and signed. Hassoun laid his seal beside my name. The ledger was made. There's something about you, Hassoun said, setting down his cup, that reminds me of the old merchant princes from Suhari, the ones who didn't inherit and had to build instead. I built this caravan, I said. Everything it is comes from calculation, not inheritance. It shows, he said. Your terms are acceptable. I'll have the resupply team prepare the cistern access tomorrow morning. The amberless cases will be collected at sunset today? They will, I confirmed. The amberless cases were stored in the cistern complex, cool underground chambers where the waystation kept temperature-sensitive trade goods. The air shifted as we descended the stone stairs, becoming damp and thick, carrying the mineral smell of deep water and the faint green-gold tang of amberless itself. Hassoun led me to the chamber where the cases were kept, stacked carefully on stone shelves carved into the cistern wall. The light here came from oil lamps set at regular intervals, casting long shadows across the smooth stone. The water beneath the grating that covered the cistern's mouth was dark and still, so reflective it looked like polished glass. I unsealed each case with Hassoun present, showing him the quality of the crystals, the density and clarity of the resin. The blocks inside were perfectly formed, their surfaces sharp-edged and uncracked. He inspected them with the eye of a man who knew what he was looking at, running his fingers across the sealed blocks with the careful attention of a merchant assessing value. The first case warmed my palm when I touched it, that initial dry heat that was normal for unhandled resin. But when I began examining the third case, the sensation changed. The warmth intensified, becoming something closer to fever. My hand was flushed, the heat radiating from the amberless almost uncomfortable, almost painful. I pulled my hand back, frowning at the sensation. Is something wrong? Hassoun was already resealing the first case, barely glancing at me. No, I said. Just the temperature. The crystal is warmer than expected. The deep chambers maintain heat, he said casually, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. It helps with preservation. Keeps the resin from becoming brittle. The warmth will fade once the cases are moved into open air. It's nothing to be concerned about. I nodded and finished the inspection, but the sensation lingered in my hands, that feverish heat, almost pleasant, almost intimate in the way it clung to my skin. The amberless had left a thin residue on my palms, invisible but insistent, and it continued to radiate warmth as I worked through the remaining cases. My fingers felt flushed, oversensitive, as if the residue was still actively warm against my skin rather than cooling. By the time I'd finished with all 3 cases, the heat had faded. I'd wash it off later, routine exposure, nothing unusual. But the residue clung a moment longer than I expected, and I made a mental note to check whether this batch was particularly reactive. Something to verify on the next handling. For now, the deep chamber heat was a plausible enough explanation, and Hassoun's men were waiting for the inspection to close. The cases were sealed again and loaded into Hassoun's secured storage area. The negotiation was complete. We walked back through the bazaar after the meeting, and Darian matched my pace without comment. The afternoon crowd moved through the marketplace in waves, merchants calling their wares in 3 languages, the smell of grilled meat and charred spices, the sound of wheels on packed earth and voices negotiating in low tones over bolts of cloth and pottery. He had the paper ready, Darian said quietly as we passed a spice seller whose stall reeked of cardamom and something bitter. He did. You signed it. I did. We walked a dozen paces before he spoke again. 2 seasons. 2 seasons. And every waystation master east of here will see his mark on your ledger before they see anything else you bring them. That is the cost. The way you held the principle, I don't negotiate with time. I've never heard someone say that. Most merchants do, I said. They trade both. Time and goods are interchangeable to them, so they negotiate both away. I stepped around a child chasing a goat through the bazaar, not breaking stride. I learned years ago that once you give away time, you can't buy it back with any amount of goods. The caravan moves on my schedule, or it doesn't move at all. He was silent for a moment, letting that settle. He was trying to delay you. He was trying to delay us, I confirmed. Someone told him to. We just made it not worth his effort. Made it not worth the council's investment in the delay. And if he'd pushed harder, then we would have dealt with that, I said. But he won't. He's too smart for that. We've shown him we understand the game better than he expected, and he'll respect that enough to let us go on our own terms. Darian nodded slowly. We were moving back toward the caravanserai quarter now, the sounds of the bazaar fading behind us. Behind us, Hassoun's office sat quiet in the limestone facades of the trade buildings. Ahead, The guest compound and the wagons and the crew who were waiting to know if we'd bought 3 days or if we were going to have to fight for every hour of movement. In my palms, the amberlace warmth was fading now, the residue cooling as the air of the waystation drew the heat away from my skin. I could still feel it, that feverish sensation, but it was becoming less intense, less present. By tonight, it would be completely gone. I'd wash my hands in cool water from the well, and there would be nothing left but the memory of it. We had 3 days. We had the goods. We had Hassoun's agreement, and we had his paper. The paper would follow us. A 2-season preferred stop notice was not a thing a merchant's ledger forgot. Every rival waystation between here and the Cistern deadline would read Hassoun's seal on my line before they read my terms. That was the price of moving on my schedule. It was a price I had paid with my eyes open. It was not a price I would pretend I had not paid. For now we had time. We had terms. We had a ledger that would cost me for a year. It was what the 3 days were worth. Chapter 8. The Storm. The morning had the wrong weight. Yasmin had clocked it first, over breakfast. "The barometric stone in the main hall is down a full finger," she had said, setting the teapot between us with the careful precision of a woman who did not say anything she had not already verified. "That is not a nothing number. That is a change." I had asked Soren, and Soren had taken the map out and measured the wind-dust line against the morning sky. "There is a sheer building out over the ash waste," he had said, pointing northwest. "Half a day. Maybe less if it turns." And Rayhan, walking the courtyard with her own unease in her shoulders, had flagged one more thing. Hassoun's oldest senior caravan hand, a man with the kind of face that had seen storms from this oasis in 4 decades, had been tying the south side canvas down twice, which meant he did not trust the first knot. Which meant he had seen something in the light. 3 tells. 1 oasis. Half a day's warning, maybe less. I had added the 4th myself. Standing at the high window of my quarters an hour earlier, looking down at the Cistern courtyard, I had seen Yasmin stop in her walk and put her hand flat against the south-facing retaining wall. She had held it there for the span of a breath, then marked something with chalk at the seam where the wall met the bedrock, a hairline she had apparently already noticed on day 1 and had said nothing about, because on day 1 there had been no weather to push against it. I had sent word to Hassoun's office. Hassoun's office had sent word back. The waystation crews were already moving. The bazaar canvas was coming down. The animals were being brought in. The cistern lid was being inspected. We were not caught. We had watched the sky for 3 hours and made our calls in quiet. What we were not ready for was how hard it would hit when it came. The first gust arrived mid-afternoon. It was enough to knock the water pitcher from Lyra's hands. The clay shattered on the packed earth. She didn't bend to retrieve it. She was already moving toward the shelter of the colonnade, her eyes on the sky where the light had gone the color of old bronze. The storm wasn't here yet. It was coming. "Get the crew in," I said, my voice cutting through the wind's first roar. "All inside. Now." Yasmin was already moving, herding Rayhan and Soren toward the caravanserai's main building. The animals in the courtyard, the horses, the pack animals, the ones we'd brought in for rest, were starting to panic. Soren caught a spooked mare's halter and pulled hard, dragging her toward the stables. The others followed, herd instinct stronger than fear. Darian was at the well's edge when I found him, calmly pulling up a final bucket of water. He moved with the focused grace of someone who'd learned to stay steady in chaos. He didn't question the rushing movement around him. He just secured the rope, set the bucket carefully on the lip of the well, and turned toward me. "Storm," I said. "I can feel it," he replied. The first sand hit like pellets. The bazaar quarter erupted into coordinated motion. Hassoun appeared in the central square like a man who'd been waiting for this moment all his life, which perhaps he had. The waystation's crew moved in practiced formation, securing the bazaar stalls, gathering loose goods, reinforcing the market's canvas coverings. No panic. No waste of energy. I found myself in the thick of it, pulling at rope, checking the ties on fabric, making sure nothing was going to come loose and tear itself to pieces in the violence that was coming. The wind was building now, gusting in harder waves, testing every knot, every connection, every surface that could catch air. The well towers shuddered. The cistern structure groaned against the pressure. Hassoun caught my eye across the square. "The cistern," he called over the rising noise. "I know," I called back. "Get what you can secure." The real threat wasn't the surface. It was what came below. By the time I made it back to the caravanserai, the storm had fully arrived. The light had gone to twilight, and sand howled through the compound like something alive. The colonnade that ran along the courtyard's edge was doing its job, creating a wind shadow, but only barely. The pressure was immense. The crew was huddled in the main building, in the central hall where Hassoun had held his office that day that felt like it had happened a year ago. The windows here were small and set high, which meant less sand but also less light. Oil lamps had been lit. Their flames guttered with every gust of air that found its way in. "Status," I said to Yasmin. "Everything secured that can be," she said. "Wagons are buttoned up. Animals are calm. We're fine up here." "The cistern's retaining wall is south-facing," I said. "The force of this is going to be directly against it." Yasmin's eyes shifted. She understood what that meant. A retaining wall that was built to hold tons of water back. A structure that was being tested by wind pressure it might not be designed for. "We should check it," she said. "Not in this," I replied. "We wait until." The impact was like a hammer against stone. The building swayed. Just slightly. Just enough that everyone in the room felt it. Just enough that the lamp flames dipped sideways as the structure shifted. "That was the wall," Darian said. He was standing at one of the high windows, his hand on the stone frame. His voice was calm in a way that made it clear he wasn't calm at all. "The primary cistern wall. It just took impact." "How can you—" Soren started. "Because I can feel it," Darian said quietly. "The structure is singing. When something hits stone that hard, the whole system vibrates. I can feel the frequency down here." The second impact was harder. And this time I heard the sound underneath the wind, a deep, terrible cracking sound that echoed up from below. I was already moving toward the stairs that led to the cistern complex. The underground chambers were different in a storm. The sounds echoed strangely, the wind finding its way through ventilation shafts that I hadn't even known existed until I heard it howling down them. The light from my hand lamp cast wild shadows as I descended. The air smelled wrong. Not just damp anymore, but sharp with the smell of freshly broken stone. The retaining wall came into view as I reached the cistern chamber, and I stopped. There was a crack along the seam where the wall met the bedrock foundation. It was thin, maybe the width of 2 fingers at its widest point. But the stone surrounding it was wet, and the water beneath the stone grating that covered the cistern's mouth was moving in a way it shouldn't have been. The level was rising. Slowly, but definitely rising. "It's breaching," Darian said behind me. I'd heard him come down the stairs, but I hadn't known he'd followed. I turned, and he was standing at the lip of the chamber, staring at the crack with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "How bad?" I asked. "Bad enough. The pressure from the storm is pushing the wall inward. The structure is trying to compensate by shifting the load. But the stone is failing." He moved down the remaining stairs and approached the wall. "I can hear it trying to hold. It's singing under the strain." I didn't ask how he could hear stone singing. Some things I was still learning not to question. The third impact from above was violent enough that dust fell from the ceiling. Darian put his hands on the crack. There was no warning, no dramatic gesture, no incantation or visible magic or anything that would have made it clear what he was doing. He just placed his hands on the fractured stone, his fingers spread across either side of the break, and went very still. I felt it then, that strange pressure in the air that I'd learned meant he was doing something. Not to living things, but to the space itself. The air became heavier. My ears popped. There was a sound underneath the wind, underneath the cracking stone, underneath everything. A low humming frequency that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the stone itself. The crack didn't close. Not visibly. But something changed. The water level stopped rising. The terrible groaning of the stone under strain eased into a different sound, something almost peaceful, almost like the material had found its equilibrium again. Like Darian had reminded the stone how it was supposed to support itself. He held the position for a long moment. His shoulders were rigid with effort. I could see sweat on his temple despite the cool air of the cistern chamber. But when he finally pulled his hands away, the wall was stable. The humming faded. The crack was still there. The wall was still breached. But it was holding. The stone had returned to bearing its weight the way it was meant to, and the pressure from above, still immense, still testing every joint and seam, was being met with a material that had remembered how to resist. Darian turned away from the wall, and I saw his hands shaking. "Is it enough?" I asked. "For now," he said. His voice sounded thin, stretched, like something in him had paid a cost that I wasn't going to ask him to explain right now. "The storm will pass. The stone will hold. But we need to reinforce it properly once the weather clears. This is not permanent." "I know," I said. Above, another impact shook the building, but the cistern wall didn't move. For a moment, neither did we. He was standing with his hands loose at his sides now, the tremor still running through them, his shoulders low with the weight of whatever it had cost. I was watching him, and he knew I was watching him, and he did not look away. There was nothing to say about what he had just done. And that was the point. He had not named it. He had not explained it. He had done it because the wall needed it, and then stopped the moment it was enough, and now he was standing in the cool of the cistern with the shaking in his hands, and the cost settled plainly across his face, and he was letting me see all of it. I did not reach for him. I did not speak. I let the recognition pass between us in the silence that had held since the humming faded, the specific silence of one person watching another choose restraint in a moment that could have been power, and understanding, for the first time, what kind of man he was. Then he straightened, and I straightened, and we turned toward the stairs. When we climbed back up to the main hall, the crew saw us, and something in their faces changed. They'd been waiting to know if we were going to have to evacuate, if the waystation was going to become dangerous, if the caravan was going to be forced into a decision between our water supply and our safety. Yasmin looked at me. "It's stable," I said. "The wall is holding. We're not in danger." I didn't say. Darian went below and did something to stone that I didn't fully understand. And now we're all still here because he put his hands on the wall and it listened. I didn't need to. They could read it in the way he was standing, in the careful control it was taking for him to remain upright, in the way I was looking at him, not with fear, but with something else. Something like recognition. Hassoun appeared in the doorway to the outer hall. His face was composed, but I could see the understanding there too. He'd felt the building shift. He'd felt it stabilize. And he was a man smart enough to understand what had just happened down in the cistern, even if the mechanism remained invisible to him. The storm raged on through the night, but the cistern wall held. The water level steadied. The stone had been attuned to its load by a man who understood frequencies and pressure and the way material things wanted to be shaped. By someone who could choose restraint in a moment that could have been power. By morning, the wind had passed, and the crew began to understand something they hadn't before. The passenger who stood quietly in the back of negotiations was not a burden to be managed. He was an asset the caravan carried, a capability that served. Hassoun understood it too. I could see it in the way he looked at Darian when we emerged from the cistern chamber, not with fear, but with reassessment. With the dawning realization that the merchant he'd tried to squeeze had resources he hadn't fully accounted for. The caravan had a mage who could hold stone together under impossible pressure. And that changed the calculation of everything that came next. Chapter 9. The Descent. The cistern complex was cool in a way that went beyond the simple absence of sun. It was the coolness of stone that had been sheltering water for centuries, of air that had never felt wind, of a place that existed in the world's quiet basement. I descended alone as I'd planned, a merchant conducting final due diligence before departure. Final checks on infrastructure. Final confirmation that the waystation's water supply was adequate for the caravan's needs. Legitimate cover for legitimate inspection. Hassoun would expect it. He was a man who understood that competent traders verified everything. The stairs spiraled down through layers of stone. I could feel the temperature dropping as I went deeper, my breath beginning to mist faintly in the light from my hand lamp. The walls here were ancient, older than Tal-Veshaan itself, older than most of the settlements on the Amber Route. The stone had a pale, almost luminous quality that suggested mineral veins, something in the composition that caught and held light even when the source was artificial. My footsteps echoed against the stone, hollow and small in the vast enclosed space. The air smelled of mineral-sharp water, of seepage, of the deep earth itself. The kind of smell that made you aware of how much rock and weight existed above you, pressing down with the patience of geological time. The cistern chamber opened before me like a cathedral. The central pool occupied most of the floor, its water still and dark and precisely measured by the marks carved into the stone wall beside it. Wooden grating covered the surface, secure and aged, clearly maintained with regular care. The water beneath was clear enough that I could see the bottom channels that fed it, stone conduits carved to direct flow from the deep aquifer upward into the cisterns containing walls. The walls themselves bore the scars of maintenance and time. Mineral deposits striped the stone in pale bands, evidence of water levels rising and falling with seasons, with drought, with the demands of the waystation above. Everything here was functional. Everything was precisely what a waystation's water management should look like. This was the surface level, the obvious part. But the real structure lay in the chambers branching off from the main cistern storage areas, processing spaces, the infrastructure that kept water moving and managed. I'd seen the plans during negotiations. I'd noted the layout. And now, with no one watching, and the late afternoon giving me hours before the crew would expect my return, I moved deeper, my lamp casting dancing shadows against walls that had been keeping their secrets since long before I was born. The first chamber held clay amphorae, large storage vessels stacked in careful rows. I had come down with a theory already in my head, that if there was something to find, it would be in the storage, hidden among ordinary vessels where no one looked twice. So I looked. I walked the rows, lifting my lamp close to the clay caps, reading the stamps one by one. Tal-Veshaan standard mark, every one. I picked out the amphora with the oldest-looking seal, pressed a thumb against its cap, worked it loose. The smell was olive oil and faint mineral silt. Nothing. Ordinary waystation provisioning. I set the cap back. I had been wrong. The storage chamber was exactly what it looked like, and I had wasted a quarter-hour confirming it. Bahram had told me once that a merchant who only looked where she expected to find a thing never found anything she had not already brought with her. I had his lesson, and I had ignored it, because I had wanted the evidence to be in the easy place. I straightened and moved on. The second chamber held provisions, dried dates, grain stores, the practical foodstuffs that kept a waystation running through the lean months. I moved through without stopping. It was between the second chamber and the next passage that the footsteps came. Not my own. Somewhere above, at the cistern chamber level, a man's boots on the wooden grating. Unhurried. The pace of someone doing a routine circuit of the water management, not of someone searching for an intruder. But he was coming down. I killed my lamp. The chamber dropped into a dark so complete that it pressed against my eyes like cloth. I pressed flat into the recess behind the last provision rack, my back against cold stone, the edge of a grain sack against my hip. I made my breathing small and even. I counted my pulse because counting gave my mind something to do that was not panic. The footsteps reached the stairs into the lower passages and came partway down. They stopped. A lamp's light swelled at the edge of the passage mouth, spilling amber across the stone. I heard a man cough once, softly. Then the scrape of something being checked, a seal, a latch, a regulating wheel at the passage head. Maintenance. Not a search. He did not come into my chamber. He did not pass me. He went back up. I stayed where I was for another long count after the light had gone. Then I lit my lamp again, and I found my hands were entirely steady, which told me something about myself that I filed away for later. I moved deeper. The third chamber. The air changed as I passed through its entrance. It was colder here, deliberately so, and there was an underlying scent beneath the mineral stone smell, something botanical and faintly acrid that I couldn't quite place. The kind of smell that suggested chemical processing, refinement, work being done in the dark. Wooden crates filled the far end of the chamber, stacked against the wall with a kind of deliberate organization that screamed significant inventory. Not the casual storage of a waystation. This was methodical, permanent. The crates were new relative to the stone around them, the wood still pale and unfaded, the marks upon them sharp and recent. I approached slowly, my lamp casting sharp shadows across the wood grain. Each crate bore markings, not Tal-Veshaan's standard notation, not the Trade Council's official trade stamps, but something else. A secondary marking. Something that suggested dual ownership, dual purpose, dual accountability. The corner of the nearest crate bore a partial impression that I had to lean close to read. Suhari route, processing batch, authority mark, abbreviated but unmistakable once you understood the code. This wasn't raw goods in transit. This was material being actively managed, being refined. I reached out and touched the wood. The surface was dust-coated, the kind of fine particles that clung to anything left in a closed space for weeks, maybe months. And beneath the dust, withdrew my hand and looked at my palm. The residue was pale gold, warm. It clung to my skin with a kind of persistence that made my arm hair stand up. Amberless. Not the structured, sealed tribute cases I'd paid in sealed copper. This was processed, broken down, refined into a powder fine enough to settle into the pores of human skin, to sit on stone like liquid light, to suggest that somewhere downstream from this chamber, someone was taking the raw material and turning it into something else entirely. I didn't open the crates. That wasn't necessary. The evidence on the stone floor around them told me everything I needed to understand. Amberless dust lay in thin drifts along the wall where the crate stood, pale as sand, catching my lamp's light like threads of spun gold. It filled the grooves and corners where the wooden crates pressed against the ancient stone. It clung to the walls in traces that had been accumulating for months, long enough to have settled deep into the pores of the rock itself, long enough to have become part of the cistern's permanent landscape. I stood very still. This wasn't a waystation conducting standard trade. This wasn't even a waystation with illicit goods moving through in the dark. This was a processing node, a refinery, a point in a supply chain that reached beyond the ordinary movement of goods across the amber route. Someone, some institution, was taking raw amberless and breaking it down here, in secret, in the depths of Tal-Veshaan's Cistern complex, extracting something from it, creating something with it, processing it into whatever form made it valuable enough for the council to maintain an operation like this. The Trade Council. Of course. Hassoun's precision. The timing. The way he'd known exactly what tribute to demand, as if he'd been calculating not the price of passage but the accessibility of goods. The familiarity with which he'd named the cost, without any of the haggling a truly independent broker would employ. Every piece of the negotiation snapped into place, each one suddenly transparent. He wasn't independent at all. He was an agent, a processing coordinator, a man running one of the council's supply nodes and reporting upstream every movement that crossed through his waystation, tracking merchants, timing delays, facilitating the movement of goods that required careful management. A relay point in a machine far larger than anything Hassoun himself controlled. And if the council was here, if they had an operation running in the Cistern complex. My hands were shaking. I realized it with a start, saw the lamplight trembling across the stone wall, felt the loss of control in the small muscles of my fingers. Darian, who had descended into this place with me, who the crew had brought through the gates, who Hassoun had certainly reported to whatever council contact he maintained. A mage, visible to institutional eyes, traveling through a waystation where the council was actively processing amberless. The thought stopped me cold, made my breath catch in a way I couldn't quite recover from. Hassoun had seen Darian, spoken with him, read whatever he could from a man's bearing and manner. In a place where the council was actively processing amberless, a mage would be visible, targetable, noticed. I put my hands flat against the stone wall to steady them. The anger came in behind the shake, cold, the way I needed it cold. Not the hot kind. The kind that settled in the center of my chest and sharpened thinking into a weapon. Angry at Hassoun's performance. Angry at the way every demand had been measured not against what the caravan could bear, but against what the council needed to extract from it. Angry at the ease with which I had been moved through a script I had not known I was reading. And under the anger, the harder thing. Darian was in this waystation. A mage, walking through a processing node for the one substance that amplified resonance. The nightmare had told me he had something already costing him. Hassoun had seen him, measured him, would have relayed. Whatever came next on this road was going to come for him specifically. I could not tell him. Not here. Not in the chamber, not at the surface, not until we were far enough out that the telling did not put the knowing into the wrong ears. He could read my face better than most people. I would have to manage my face. That was a cost I had not yet budgeted for. I stood alone in that chamber with the pale dust on my palm and the crates at my back and the light from my single lamp moving against the walls, and I did the one thing the moment allowed. I stopped. I let the full shape of it settle into the place where it would have to live now. We were leaving on schedule. 3 days, as I had told Hassoun. Not 1 hour more. I would carry what I had seen, and I would carry the protection of him not yet knowing, and I would decide on the road what parts I could put into Darian's hands without costing him the balance he was already struggling to hold. I rubbed the dust off my palm against the dark wool of my skirt. It came away with difficulty, a pale ghost of itself smeared into the weave. Then I raised my lamp and turned back toward the stairs. The climb out was longer than the climb down had been. That was what discovery did. It did not add stone to the passage. It only added weight to the body that had to carry it. When I reached the cistern chamber proper, the late afternoon light was filtering down from the surface vents, distant, strange, the light of a world that still believed itself ordinary. I stood for a moment at the edge of the wooden grating, breathing air that no longer felt clean, and I did the small housekeeping of the face. I unset the jaw. I lowered the shoulders. I put back on the expression of a merchant completing a competent final inspection. Then I went up. Chapter 10. The Cistern. I held the shape of the day on my face through the evening meal and past the last watch change. Whatever I had put back on of myself at the cistern grating had held through supper, through Yasmin's routine report, through the ordinary movement of a crew settling. Darian had watched me across the fire and said nothing. That was his courtesy. He had seen the seam in my composure the moment I came up from the cistern, and he had not pressed. He had eaten quietly, spoken to Soren about the horses, asked Rayhan one small question about a harness buckle, and then gone to his tent without looking at me again. It was not indifference. It was the opposite. It was a man giving me until I was ready. I was ready when the camp had gone still. I went to his tent without a lamp. The twin moons were high enough to move by. I scratched once at the canvas, and he was awake and upright before I had finished the second breath. "Dress," I said. "Bring a lamp. I need you to come somewhere with me." He did not ask. He dressed, took up the small brass hand lamp he carried, and followed me across the waystation courtyard with the ordinary carriage of 2 people returning to an interrupted errand. We crossed the main hall. We crossed the antechamber where Hassoun had held his office. No one stopped us. A single night porter raised his head and dropped it again at the sight of me. I was a merchant who had done her surface inspection in daylight and was now doing whatever merchants did at night, which in his experience was not his concern. At the top of the cistern stairs I stopped and looked at Darian. His face in the lamplight was the still, composed face I had seen across the fire, but the eyes were not. "You are about to see something," I said. "I want you to see it because you have the right to. But after we come back up, you are going to have to manage your face, and I need to know now if you can." "I can," he said. I went down. He followed. The descent was faster the second time. I did not detour through the amphora chamber. I did not stop at the provisions. I took him past the maintenance passage that the night patrol had not chosen to walk tonight and into the 3rd chamber, and when we stepped across its threshold, I stopped and let him see without narration. He stood 2 paces behind me with his lamp raised. I heard him take one breath, hold it, and release it slowly. "You are afraid," he said. Not a question. An observation stated with such certainty that I understood he was reading something in my face that I wasn't attempting to hide. I turned to face him fully. The chamber seemed to narrow around us, the crates, the dust, the weight of institutional crime made visible on stone that had no defense against seeing it. "No?" I said. My voice sounded sharp in the close air, brittle as worked glass. "I'm not afraid." His eyes did not leave mine. "I'm angry," I said. The words settled between us with their own gravity. This was not the hot, thoughtless anger that burned through reason. This was the cold kind, the kind that froze everything unnecessary away and left only clarity. I was angry at Hassoun's performance. Angry at a trade council that had braided itself so completely into the ordinary movement of goods that you could mistake its leverage for hospitality. Angry that I had been played so thoroughly that every moment of the negotiation revealed itself as staged, calculated, precise. And angry that I had brought him here. That I had made the choice to put him in front of the thing that would now mark him, because the alternative, keeping it from him, was a worse arithmetic than telling him the truth at the risk of his face. "Tell me what I'm looking at," he said quietly. So I did. I walked him through the crates, the residue patterns, the stone channels that no ordinary waystation would bother to carve. I showed him the marks on the wood, not Tal-Veshaan's standard notation, not the Trade Council's official stamps, but something else. A secondary marking. Suggestion of dual ownership, of accountability that reached beyond the local node. He understood what it meant as quickly as I had. His lamp caught the pale dust as he moved closer to the crates, and I could see the moment the full weight of it registered. Not surprise. Surprise implied he had expected something different. This was the settling of pieces into a pattern he had already suspected might exist. The chamber was silent around us. Just the hum of cistern depth, the particular absence of sound that came from being this far underground, this far removed from the ordinary movement of air and light. I was still. Still in a way that I let him see, that I knew he would read for exactly what it was. My heartbeat was faster than I wanted it to be. Anger and something else, something that looked like fear if you didn't know the difference between fear and the knowledge that choice was about to narrow itself into a sharp and dangerous point. He met my eyes. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because I wanted to," I said. And the words came out steady, certain. The kind of certain that only comes from clarity. And I'm done not doing things I want. I moved first. I had known I would, from the moment I scratched at the canvas of his tent, and he had come without asking. Had known it with the kind of knowing that bypasses choice and goes straight into action. I closed the distance between us, and I took his jaw in my hand the way I had wanted to since the moment I heard him say my name with that particular weighted certainty. The way I had wanted to since the negotiation chamber, since the cistern descent, since the nightmare that had cracked his careful armor and left me seeing the person beneath. His mouth met mine, and the shock of contact traveled through me like a physical thing. Not the romantic shock of fiction, not the swooning certainty that the world had rearranged itself. This was sharper than that. This was the knowledge that I had made a choice, and the immediate awareness of what it meant, what alliance I had just declared, what sides I had just chosen, what future had just become irrevocable. I could feel his heartbeat through his ribs, pressed against my own sternum. It was faster than it should be. I could read his control slipping, the careful discipline he maintained cracking at the edges of contact. And I understood that this mattered to him in a way that went beyond attraction, that he was reading my pulse the same way I was reading his, that we were both cataloging the physical truth of what we wanted beneath all the careful negotiation. His hand came up to my jaw, warm where the stone behind me was cold, steady where I could feel my own certainty wavering at the edges. He was letting me lead. I realized that with a clarity that was almost painful. He could have taken control of this moment. He had the strength for it, the knowledge, the power. Instead, he was following, letting me set the pace, letting me measure the deepness of the kiss the way I needed to measure it. I could taste dust and urgency on him, and stone, and the faint mineral-sharp flavor of the cistern air itself. My breath caught when I realized that he was trembling, not from fear but from effort. From holding himself in check. From the strain of not taking this moment and claiming it, of instead letting me claim it first. The kiss was not soft. It was not romantic in the way that poetry would describe. It was short and deliberate, and it contained within it the entire truth of what we had just become to each other. Not passenger and master. Not captor and freed. Allies. Co-conspirators. Two people standing against institutional power in the dark beneath a waystation, and neither of us willing to flinch from what that meant. When I pulled back, his eyes stayed open. Mine did too. I was still in control of my own breathing. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, the anger and the clarity settling into something more sustainable, more useful. "What do we do?" he asked. His voice was quiet, practical. There was no suggestion of lingering in the feeling. Both of us understood the danger too clearly for that. "We leave on schedule," I said. I had decided this alone in the chamber that afternoon before I had brought him down to see. We take what we know. We figure out the rest on the road. He nodded once. He was still looking at the crates, at the dust, at the architecture of the council's operation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular certainty that told me he had been thinking along the same paths. "And we don't tell the crew until we're beyond the first horizon," he said. It was not quite what I had planned to say. But it was right. Yasmin was loyal, but loyalty and institutional pressure were not always the same currency. And there were others, Soren, Rehan, the peripheral crew who moved goods and asked few questions. Any of them might have been watched. Any of them might be reporting. I noticed the tremor in his hand as he lowered his lamp, the cost of the work he had done 2 days ago holding the cistern wall back from collapse. A small betrayal of control that marked him with the weight of choices made in moments of crisis. Post-resonance, he was running on less than full capacity. Which meant we could not afford to be slow. Could not afford to dally. Could not afford to let Hassoun have time to calculate our next move before we made it. "The wall is still holding," he said. Not a question. A confirmation. "It is," I said. "Thank you." The words were inadequate, but they were what I had. The chamber was silent around us, cold and ancient and holding secrets the way it had held them for centuries. But the air between us had changed. The weight of discovery had shifted into something else entirely. Not fear, not excitement, but the particular clarity that comes when two people standing in the same space understand they are standing against the same thing. We turned toward the stairs in unison, both of us aware that the longer we remained in this chamber, the greater the risk of exposure. The longer we stood breathing the same air, reading each other's heartbeats, the more carefully we would have to hide it. "One more thing," I said as we climbed. "When we reach the burning passage approach." "I'll know," Darian said. "I'll feel it when we're close." Of course he would. He could sense resonance in stone, could feel pressure in material things. A mage approaching a place where institutional power had carved its intentions into the landscape would feel it coming like a storm. Behind us, the evidence remained, waiting in its cold chamber, waiting for whoever came next to find it, waiting for whatever consequences this discovery would eventually trigger. But we were no longer isolated observers. We were something else now. Something more dangerous. Something bound together by shared knowledge and shared threat. When we emerged into the cistern chamber proper, the moonlight filtering down from the surface vents seemed distant and strange. We had entered one world and emerged into another, but the distance between them was measured not in vertical space but in certainty. We would leave this waystation on schedule. We would carry our evidence forward. We would not tell the crew until we were safe. And we would do it together. The caravan was waiting above. The crew was waiting. Hassoun was waiting with his reports half-written, his calculations incomplete, his knowledge still fragmentary. But something had shifted in that chamber beneath the stone. Something that could not be unseen or unbroken or returned to what it had been. I had chosen. And I was done not doing things I wanted. Chapter 11. Aftermath. The briefing notes were spread across my planning table in 3 clean lines. Route, timing, logistics, water budgets for 5 days to the first major well, the practical architecture of departure, the same departure I had planned with Hassoun 3 days ago, before the evidence, before the cistern, before Darian followed me into the dark and witnessed the full weight of what our exposure meant. I had not slept. Not from fear. Not from the ordinary kind of insomnia that comes from nerves or unsettled choices. This was the clear kind, the kind that came from running through scenarios, marking contingencies, calculating what the next sunrise would cost us if I made a single miscalculation. The camp was quiet around my tent. Just the movement of crew settling in for the night, Yasmin checking the water seals one more time, Soren running the distances, Rayhan managing the smaller animals that had weathered the crisis without injury. Normal. Ordinary. The weight of discovery still sitting in the cistern beneath us, waiting in its cool dark for whatever came next. Darian appeared at my tent entry without warning. Not sneaking. Simply present, as if he had calculated the exact moment when I would look up. "The crew's ready," he said. Not a question. A statement. He was reading something in my posture that I wasn't bothering to hide, too tired, too focused on the task ahead to maintain the ordinary deflections. I set the briefing notes aside. "Come in." He did. The tent space seemed to contract around him, not from his size, but from the intensity of focus he brought. There was a tremor in his left hand that I had noticed growing steadily worse since the cistern stabilization 2 days ago. The cost of using resonance was cumulative, and he had pushed hard holding that wall back from collapse. I did not comment on the tremor. Nor did I offer him anything, water, wine, a place to sit. Instead, I waited. "You sit at the table tonight," I said. "During the briefing. Not as passenger. Not as secondary. At the table." He understood what I was not saying. That his integration into the crew's visible structure was no longer theoretical. That what had happened beneath the stone had consequences that rippled upward into the ordinary movement of the caravan's hierarchy. That Yasmin would notice. That Soren would process. That the crew would understand, without being told, that something had shifted. He nodded once. "I know." The moment was brief. Tactical. But I could feel the weight of it, the communication that was not about the kiss, not about the council's reach we now carried forward, but about alliance. About the fact that we were no longer passenger and master. We were something harder to define and far more dangerous. "The tremor's worse," I said. "I'll manage." "I know you will." He turned toward the tent entry, and I did not call him back. Instead, I watched him disappear into the camp's ordinary movement, already aware that I would need to adjust my calculations. His pain tolerance was not infinite, even if his resolve was. And we could not afford for him to fail when the burning passage approached. The crew briefing took place in the central caravanserai space. The common ground where we gathered for planning, for meals, for the ordinary commerce of coordinating 12 people, 3 wagons, and 5 days of travel through terrain that forgave nothing. Yasmin was there first. Soren arrived with the water manifests. Rayhan settled onto a crate, her attention already on the logistics before I opened my mouth. Lyra hovered at the outer edge. She was young, attached to Yasmin, still learning the weight of crew responsibility. The others drifted in. The space filled with the particular silence that came before orders were given. Darian sat at the table. Not pushed to one side. Not standing. Seated at the planning surface itself, at the same level as the crew members who ran the practical operations. The shift was small. Invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Yasmin was looking for it. I saw her eyes catch the moment he pulled up a crate and settled. The sharp, assessing look that had marked her for years as someone who noticed patterns the rest of us missed. She did not comment. Did not even fully change her expression. But I registered the moment she filed it away as significant. "Dawn departure," I said, moving past it. 3 wagons. Full water contingency. 5 days to the first major well. Standard formation. I marked the route on the map with a deliberate finger, north and west, moving away from Tal-Veshaan's shadow toward the burning passage and the roads beyond. We agreed on 3 days with Hassoun. We leave on the 3rd dawn as planned. "Clean exit," Soren said. It was not a question. He was confirming the principle. The caravan did not linger once arrangements were concluded. We took what was offered, we moved, we did not look back. "Clean exit," I repeated. 3 days, cases paid, no collateral. No delays, no negotiations, no lingering. Rayhan tested the boundary by asking Darian directly about the horse conditioning, a practical crew-level question about whether the animals that had sheltered during the storm were ready for hard travel. Darian answered with the kind of detail that told me he had been paying attention, had already assessed the caravan's physical state, knew exactly what condition we were traveling in. I did not redirect him. Did not soften or correct. I simply let the answer stand, and in doing so communicated something to the entire crew. That he was worth listening to. That his assessment carried weight. That the caravan accepted his presence as something other than passenger. "That went cleaner than I expected," Yasmin said. She was referring to the whole Tal-Veshaan experience, the negotiation, the storm, the crisis in the cistern, the extraction. Hassoun could have been worse. "He was exactly what I expected," I said. "It's still messy. We just left the mess behind." It was my principle, and the crew knew it. I did not philosophize often. But when I did, they listened. Darian added nothing. His presence at the table was the statement. That he was crew now. That the caravan was stronger for it. That the power we had uncovered in the dark had met with something it had not anticipated. A mage who chose to serve a woman who refused to be delayed. The briefing concluded with the details. Water rationing. Rotation of riders. Watch schedules. The ordinary architecture of departure. The crew dispersed to their preparations, and I watched them move through the camp with the particular efficiency of people who had spent a decade learning to move as a unit. Yasmin lingered a moment after the others had left. "He's different now," she said. "Not a question." "We're all different," I said. "That's what Tal-Veshaan cost us." She nodded once and turned away, and I did not elaborate. Some truths were better left unspoken. The crew would understand by action, by the way the caravan operated, by the way Darian sat at the table and contributed without demanding. Understanding came from experience, not explanation. Later, in the deep silence of the camp settling into sleep, I lay awake in my tent and did what I had not allowed myself to do since the cistern. I thought about the choice. I listened to the camp breathe around me, the slow creak of canvas, a horse shifting its weight at the picket line, Rayhan's low voice somewhere checking a knot she had already checked twice. The ordinary sounds of people who trusted the perimeter. Bahram had told me once that I carried my thoughts too visibly on my hands. that I should learn to hide what I was feeling if I wanted to survive in a world that did not trust women who calculated. I had stopped listening to Bahram's instructions a long time ago. The episode's arc was clear to me now, laid out in the quiet of midnight like a map I had drawn myself. Hassoun squeeze, refused, not from strength but from principle. The nightmare that had cracked Darian's armor. The Cistern evidence. The kiss. And now, the tactical recalibration that meant I was no longer leading a caravan. I was leading an alliance. The cost was exposure. Darian's tremor was worsening. The threat was escalating at a speed I could feel but not quite measure. Every moment we remained in Tal-Veshaan increased the risk of discovery, of pursuit, of the burning passage becoming something far more dangerous than it had been when we planned our route 5 days ago. The gain was clarity. I had never been this exposed, emotionally, politically, in terms of alliance and commitment. I had spent a decade hiding my strength behind Bahram's front. I had spent these first days with Darian maintaining a careful distance, a professional coexistence, the kind of relationship you could sever if the cost became too high. That was no longer possible. By kissing him in the cistern, by choosing him as co-conspirator in that moment of discovery, I had made a choice that could not be unmade. I had aligned myself with him, visibly, politically, in a way that meant we would rise or fall together. And I did not regret it. No doubt. No guilt. No lingering on the consequences. Just the clear, cold knowing that I had done exactly what I wanted to do, and I was willing to pay whatever price that created. The twin moons were visible from my tent opening, the pale emerald one that hung over the ash waste, and the deeper amber moon that tracked its own path across Kazira's sky. They had been visible on the night of the kiss too. The same light had fallen on the cistern stone, had caught the pale dust of evidence, had illuminated the moment I chose to stop pretending that safety was more important than want. The caravan was ready. 3 days. 5 days of hard travel to the first major well. The burning passage beyond that. Routes that Khorram's agents might be tracking, roads where the Trade Council's scouts might already be positioned. All of it coming forward, all of it waiting. But tonight, in the stillness of my tent, with the crew settled into their final preparation for departure, I allowed myself the luxury of certainty. I had made my choice. I had no regrets. And I was willing to move forward into whatever came next. The dawn was hours away. The caravan would ride on my terms. And for the first time since my marriage to Bahram, I was choosing to lead without apology, without shadow, without the burden of pretense. I was done not doing things I wanted. Tomorrow, we would move. Tonight, I permitted myself to be still. Chapter 12. The Counter. The intelligence files were spread across Hassan's desk in the gray light of dawn, a dozen dossiers, each marked with the Trade Council seal, each containing the careful documentation of political problems that required careful solutions. He was a methodical man. This had always been his strength. The notes from the Cistern crisis sat at the center of the pile. Witness accounts, compiled by his staff. A mage steadied the stone. Non-combat work. Resonance-based. The wall stopped cracking when the mage took position. More detail from the crew members who had watched from the perimeter. Tremor in the left hand. Visible instability. Concentrated effort. The work took everything from him. Hassoun had not understood at first. A mage was useful. A mage with resonance capability was leverage. But leverage over whom? He had known only that the Vasrin caravan carried a passenger with magical ability, and that the Trade Council was interested in the transaction. That was sometimes enough. Then the witnesses had mentioned the tremor. Harmonic drift. Physical deterioration from repeated resonance use. There were markers in the Council's archives, signs that led to a specific family, a specific exile, a specific set of problems that had been resolved by removing them from Kasira's landscape. He stood and moved toward the archive chamber, a stone room 2 levels below the waystation's main administrative floor. The air grew cooler as he descended, the stone walls darkening into the particular gray that meant depth and time. The archives here were climate-controlled by design. Heat damage to the oldest dossiers had been an early lesson, decades ago. The Trade Council's memory was precious. The Council protected what it needed to remember. The filing system was comprehensive, cross-referenced, obsessive. Each family that had been removed from Kasira's legitimate sphere occupied a full section in the archive's geometry. Hassoun found the section marked Testline Exiles without hesitation. The dossiers were organized by name, by date, by the specific competencies that had made them dangerous enough to remove instead of control. He opened the first file. The smell of old paper and preserved ink filled his lungs, the smell of institutional memory, of decisions made and filed and locked away. Decades. The family had wielded material resonance, a rare ability, precious in their way, and absolutely incompatible with the Council's monopoly on high-grade resonance work. Easier to exile them than negotiate. Easier to track them afterward. The Council did not like uncertainty. It did not like power that could not be controlled through established channels. The tremor? That detail. It was a marker. A known consequence of Testline magic. The Council had documented it years ago in the family members they had observed before exile, the deterioration visible in their hands after extended work, the physical cost written in involuntary motion. He turned the pages slowly. Photographs of younger faces. Clinical notes on abilities observed. Behavioral assessments. The paperwork of removal, the official procedures through which a person could be quietly extracted from a settled position and relocated to wherever the Council deemed appropriate. Not death. Not public trial. Just administrative precision. The absence of a life in the place it had been, the presence of that life somewhere else, somewhere far from the Council's core operations. One face. Younger than the man now traveling with the Vasrin caravan, but the structure of the features was precise. The same bone geometry. The same particular arrangement of light and shadow across a face that might have been handsome once, before it learned to be careful. The name was in the archives, attached to records from 15 years ago, before the removal, before the silence. Darian Kess. The age was correct. The timeline was correct. And a mage with a harmonic tremor, capable of material resonance work, choosing to hide among merchant caravans instead of taking the obvious path of institutional employ that fit the pattern of someone trying to survive outside Council oversight. Someone who had been deemed a problem and had learned to be invisible. This was the kind of intelligence that moved north at the speed of trained birds. Hassoun did not feel triumph. He felt the familiar weight of competent professional work. The weight of knowing that he had done exactly what he was supposed to do, recognized a pattern, traced it to its source, identified the asset and its threat vector. The caravan would depart as agreed. The Council's tolerance for that departure was its own decision. His job was to relay what he had discovered, and to do it before the caravan was beyond the reach of faster riders. He left the dossiers where they lay and moved back up through the stone passages, returning to the courtyard where the courier birds were kept. The handlers had fed them already. The routine never changed, even at dawn. The birds paced in their cages, waiting for the day's work. A young man was there, preparing the day's messages. Hassoun knew his name but did not bother with it. Names created complications. Better to think of him as the handler, as the mechanism, as part of the machinery of relay. "I need a bird," Hassoun said. "Fast route. North. Priority seal." The handler understood without further explanation. Priority meant Council Central. Priority meant the message would be relayed through the station network until it reached someone with authority to act. The handler moved without wasting time, selecting a sleek dark bird, the kind bred for the long routes, capable of sustained flight across open desert. The bird had a burnished quality to its feathers, something close to copper where the light caught the wings. It ruffled as the handler approached, but did not resist. This was what the bird was trained for. The cage was opened with a simple motion. The handler's hands moved with the quiet competence of someone who had done this thousands of times. His fingers found the bird's wing without aggression, without the kind of doubt that made animals uncertain. This was the language between handler and bird: certainty, precision, the understanding that the work was necessary. Hassoun had the message already prepared in his mind, distilled to the essentials. The brevity was important. The bird would be fast, but speed had limits. The message needed to contain everything that mattered and nothing that did not. Caravan holds Kess-line exile. Material resonance capability confirmed. Harmonic markers visible. Traveling north toward Burning Passage approach. Currently under merchant cover. Departure within hours. Advise. He did not write it out on standard parchment. He encoded it, a cipher the council used for sensitive relay, brief enough to fit in the small copper capsule the handler was now attaching to the bird's leg. The handler worked with careful precision, the capsule secured against the leg without binding too tight. The bird's foot moved slightly, testing the new weight, accepting it. Birds learned quickly that the capsule was part of what came next. The handler moved toward the caravanserai's eastern wall, to the release point where the couriers always launched. The early sun was beginning to clear the walls now, casting the courtyard in sharper light. The air was still cool, still the brief window before the real heat of the day. Ideal for flight. Hassoun followed at a distance. Not close enough to make the moment personal, but close enough to witness that the work had been completed. The handler raised his arm. The bird shifted once, settled into the particular stillness that came just before launch. The handler's hand opened, and the bird was released as the sun cleared the caravanserai walls. It launched into the gray-gold light, wings catching the current that ran above the walls, banking northward with the particular determination of a trained courier. The flight path was clean. No hesitation. No doubling back. Within hours, it would reach the first relay station, wings carrying the encoded message forward. Within a day, the message would be in the hands of someone who could authorize the consequences. The relay was committed. Hassoun turned back toward his office. The files could remain as they were, evidence of his professional diligence, a record that he had done exactly what was required of him. The caravan would depart on schedule, unaware that the relay was already in flight, already beginning the process that would define the next chapter of their journey. He did not regret it. He did not question it. Regret was a luxury he had stopped budgeting for years ago. The work was the work. The job was what you did when you chose to survive inside the council's reach, instead of risking the displacement that came from refusal. He had done what he was supposed to do. The rest was not his to manage. The caravanserai was already moving by the time I made my way through the logistics of departure. 3 days had passed exactly as agreed. Our tribute had been paid. Hassoun had accepted the terms without further negotiation. Now it was simply a matter of moving 12 people, 3 wagons, and the weight of what we had discovered in the dark, out through the gates and onto the roads beyond. I had slept poorly, if at all. My hands had been methodical through the morning, checking wagon seals, confirming water rations, verifying that Yasmin had completed her inventory without discovering anything I would need to explain. The work kept my mind occupied in a way that sleep never could. Action was always better than stillness when there were too many thoughts pressing. The courtyard was organized chaos. Crew members moved with the particular efficiency of people who had done this 100 times before. Soren was managing the final water contingency. Raihan was checking the horse conditions one more time. Lyra darted between wagons with the energy of someone young enough to believe that motion could outrun consequences. I had just finished confirming the route markers with the map when I saw the rider. He moved with purpose, cutting across the caravanserai toward the northern gates. Not a crew member. I knew every person who worked for the caravan. Not a trader. His bearing was too military, too efficient. He was leading a horse at a hard pace, the kind of pace that made sense only if you were racing distance. North. Away from the burning passage route. Away from the caravan's planned direction. My eyes caught on the detail automatically. We were traveling east. He was traveling north. This time of morning, with this sense of urgency, for no reason I could calculate. I did not follow him. Instead, I did what I had learned to do. I shifted my path slightly, angling toward the courier station instead of the wagons. The bird cages were empty. All of them. The handlers had taken them down and were storing them away from the sun. No birds. No messages in flight. Or one message in flight, at least, that had required the release of their entire stock. That required the kind of priority that Hassoun would not use lightly. The handler who was closing down the station noticed my presence without looking directly at me. I did not approach him. I simply filed what I was seeing, the empty cages, the morning departure, the rider heading north, and continued my walk toward the wagons as if I had been heading there all along. Hassoun was visible at the far edge of the caravanserai, near the administrative building. His posture was unchanged. He was not anxious about our departure. He was not hovering to confirm our terms or ensure we kept to our agreement. He was simply present, the way administrative people always were, present and interested, and already moving on to the next transaction. But he had relayed something. Something that required a fast rider and the morning departure window. Something that was already in motion, northward, ahead of us. I understood what this meant. The flag I had filed in the morning darkness, the suspicion that Hassoun's interest meant something beyond merchant protocol, resolved. He had not challenged Darian. He had not demanded revelation. He had simply done what men in Hassoun's position always did, relay the information upstream and let someone else decide how to use it. The exposure was real. The caravan was marked. I completed my walk to the wagons and settled into the familiar rhythm of final preparations. The crew did not notice my stillness. They were too focused on their own tasks, too committed to the mechanics of departure. But I felt it, the shift in clarity, the moment when suspicion became certainty. Hassoun had known. He had calculated. He had moved the way councilmen moved, not through confrontation, but through silence and relay. By the time we reached the burning passage, the council would have had hours to position whatever response they deemed appropriate. We had 3 days of travel remaining. 3 days to reach the first major well. 3 days before the roads began to narrow and the desert opened up, and we entered the passage that Khorram's scouts might already be watching. I did not share this with Darian yet. I did not tell the crew. There was nothing to tell them that would change the mechanics of departure. We would leave at dawn. We would travel the route as planned. We would move forward into whatever was waiting. But I carried the knowledge with me as I moved through the caravanserai, folded tight beneath the practical business of departure, the way a merchant carries a private ledger under the public one. A mark. A confirmation. A detail that would not change what I did, but that changed how I understood what was coming. The trap had been sprung. We had simply not felt it snap closed yet. The caravan prepared to move. The desert was waiting. And somewhere to the north, a message was traveling faster than we could ride. Chapter 13. The Departure. The dawn was gray gold, the kind that came before the real heat, the brief window when the desert was almost cool enough to think. The wagons were loaded. The crew was mounted. Everything had the sharp clarity of mechanics completed exactly as planned. I stood at the reins of the front wagon, Darian beside me, and watched the gates of Tal-Veshaan open. 3 days had passed exactly as negotiated. 3 cases of amberless had transferred ownership to Hassoun's ledger. The 2-week delay had been refused. A crew member had been refused as collateral. No escort rode with us. No names had been spoken. The terms held clean on both sides. The institutional language for that was acceptance. The practical language was that Hassoun stood at the entrance to his waystation in the soft morning light, watching us depart with the same professional courtesy he had deployed when we arrived. His hands were open at his sides. His expression was unreadable. His presence was a closing ritual, not warmth, not coldness, just the acknowledgement that a transaction was complete. Beside him stood 2 of his administrative staff. They waved. The gesture was correct. The ceremony was correct. Everything was exactly what you expected from a well-managed caravanserai on the Amber Route. And underneath it all was the knowledge that he had relayed. Yasmin rode up on the wagon's left flank, her horse moving with the easy stride of someone who had done this 100 times. "That went cleaner than I expected," she said, her eyes still on the gates. "It's still messy," I replied. "We just left the mess behind." The words were accurate. The principle I had stated 3 days earlier held. I don't negotiate with time. I negotiate with goods. We had paid for our passage, refused the delay, and moved. The cost was not what had happened in the negotiation. The cost was what was already in motion, northward, ahead of us, invisible but no less real. Soren brought his horse alongside the rear of the wagon, water calculations already finished. 3 wells to the burning passage, he reported, speaking to me but aware that Darian would hear. Clean route if we don't linger. 2 days to the first well, 1 day to the second, and we hit the approach by evening of day 3. No delays, I confirmed. No delays, he echoed, and he shifted his horse to take the lead position, scout range ahead. The wagon lurched forward. Not dramatically, just the familiar lurch of weight finding motion, wheels finding purchase in the caravanserai's packed earth. Rayhan managed the second wagon, Lyra the third. The caravan began to move as a single organism, the way it always did, as if the pause at Tal-Veshaan had never disrupted the rhythm. Darian sat quiet beside me, his hands steady on the wagon's reins that paralleled mine. We rode side by side now. Not passenger and master. Not the careful distance that had marked our first days. The configuration had shifted somewhere between the negotiation and the Cistern crisis, and the crew had settled into the new arrangement without complaint. Maybe they had always been waiting for it. Maybe competence had its own logic. But his left hand was trembling. Slight. Micro-tremor in his fingers where they held the leather rein. The kind of shake you could hide if you didn't want to be seen, and he was not trying to hide it. He was simply letting it exist, the way he let the ash waste exist around us, a fact of the landscape. I did not comment. I filed it. I filed the understanding that the tremor was the cost he had absorbed in that cistern chamber, when he had tuned the failing stone back to load-bearing frequency, and the work had taken everything from his body. Resonance always costs something. Material resonance cost focus and control. Tissue resonance cost vitality from another living being. And standing in front of a wall that was trying to crack, with a crew watching, and the oasis knowing that a mage was working, that cost had been the tremor. His cost. Like my cost was the exposure. We moved through the gates and into the open ash waste, and the oasis receded behind us, the wells, the gardens, the stone architecture that had seemed immovable 3 days ago. Nothing appeared to be following us. The road was empty. The desert was empty. The air was empty. But it was not quiet. The wind moved across the sand with the voice of something alive, something that remembered every caravan that had ever crossed these plains. The wagon wheels made their familiar sound, the grinding roll that meant the load was balanced, the mechanisms were sound, the journey had resumed. The horses breathed. The crew moved with the particular quiet efficiency of people who understood that motion was the job, not conversation. Darian shifted his weight on the wagon seat, and his hand tremored again. I watched it with the same attention I was watching the road ahead, the same way I was calculating the timeline. 3 days to the burning passage, 3 days before the roads narrowed and the desert opened up the way it did near major geographic features. 3 days before council scouts could have positioned themselves if Hassoun's message had been fast enough. I calculated it silently. I did not share it with Darian. There was nothing to tell him yet that would change what we were doing. We would travel the route as planned. We would move toward the burning passage whether the council was waiting or not. And if Hassoun had relayed, which he had, I knew it with the same bone-deep certainty that I had known a decade of merchant calculations. Then the equation had already shifted. The exposure was real. The caravan was marked. But the crew had accepted the new configuration, and they moved with the kind of solidity that came from actual unity instead of performed hierarchy. When Rayhan had needed help shifting a wagon weight that afternoon, Darian had moved without being asked, understanding the mechanics the way crew members understood mechanics. When Lyra had misjudged a turn, and the third wagon had listed slightly, Soren had corrected the angle before tension rose. When Yasmin had called for a water break at the 3-hour mark, we had stopped with the synchronization of people who had done this together for longer than the literal days we had spent in motion. The caravan made camp as the sun tilted toward the horizon. The burning passage was still 3 days away. The evening was cooling toward night. The stars were beginning to appear in the gradient of the sky. Darian sat across from me while we ate dried meat, bread that Yasmin had purchased before departure, water with the mineral taste that meant we were already pulling from the well stocks. His left hand was less steady than his right. He was favoring it slightly, keeping the tremor out of sight when he could, not performing the kind of secrecy that meant he was embarrassed, just the kind that meant the cost was his and he would manage it. "Tomorrow we reach the first well by midday," Yasmin said, speaking to the group in the way of crew members, making sure everyone understood the plan. "Day after that, the second well. And the day after that, we approach the burning passage at evening." "Water is good at all 3 wells?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from Soren's calculation. "Fresh." No reason to believe otherwise. The crew accepted this the way they accepted facts, as information that changed logistics, not emotion. Rayhan began discussing the horse rotation. Lyra was already checking the wagon mechanisms, the way she did every evening, with the bone-deep understanding that prevention was easier than repair in the ash waste. Darian said very little. When Rayhan asked a clarifying question about the wagon sequence, he answered briefly. When Soren reported the next morning's scouting range, Darian nodded. He was present. He was integrated. And he was tired in a way that spoke to the cost he was still absorbing, the price that had not finished exacting itself. I watched the crew settle around the camp, Yasmin checking the perimeter, Soren testing the water taste from the first container, Rayhan marking tomorrow's pace against the map. This was the gain. This was what the exposure had purchased. A crew that no longer wondered if they were following a widow pretending to be in command, but instead moved as one organism under unified leadership. The math was acceptable. That night, after the crew had retired to the tents and the wagons were secured for darkness, I sat on the edge of the camp and calculated the timeline again. Hassoun's message had been fast. Council birds were bred for speed, for routes across open desert, for the kind of distance that made ordinary horses look like they were standing still. His message would have reached the first relay station by evening. By this time tomorrow, it would be in the hands of someone with authority to act. By the time we reached the burning passage, the council would have had hours to position whatever response they deemed appropriate. We had 3 days of travel remaining. We had Darian's tremor, which meant his resonance work was costly and consequential. We had the exposure, which meant we were being hunted. We had a crew that was finally unified. The equation was complex. The math was still acceptable. I folded the timeline away and returned to the tent where Darian was already asleep, or pretending to sleep, his left hand visible even in the darkness, the tremor still there, still working through his body, still the price of choosing restraint in a moment when the world was watching. He had chosen to stabilize the wall instead of letting it fail. He had chosen to use his strength in service of the caravan, not in service of power. The cost was visible in his hand. I watched it for a moment longer than was necessary, then lay down beside him. The burning passage waited. The council scouts waited. The next 3 days waited. But tonight, in the darkness of the ash waste, the caravan was unified. The crew trusted the configuration. And the woman who had spent a decade hiding her strength behind a mediocre husband's front was finally leading openly, finally making the kind of choices that cost something real. The desert was patient. We would move into it when dawn returned. We would see what was waiting. Chapter 14. The Warning. The night watch was always the work of the alert. Not the fearful, the careful. The kind of attention that did not panic at shadows but registered them, filed them, distinguished the natural noise of the desert from the patterns that meant something was there, something alive, something moving with intention. Soren had the second watch, the quiet hours when the stars were brightest and the twin moons had begun their descent toward the far horizon. The crew was asleep, or as asleep as people could be on the open ash waste with a 3-day timeline collapsing toward the burning passage. Nara had gone to her tent after the evening meal and not come out again. Darian was somewhere in the dark, either sleeping or doing the very still thing he did when his body needed rest, but his mind would not comply. The camp's perimeter was secure. The wagons were positioned in the defensive arrangement they always used, wide enough to see threats, close enough to defend together. The horses were picketed 40 paces out, far enough to bolt if something came, close enough to retrieve if they needed to run. Soren walked the perimeter with the patience of someone trained in military attention. Not the rigid patrol of a fortress guard, but the mobile watchfulness of someone who had learned to recognize the moment before something happened. The moment when the desert's rhythm changed. The moment when the wind shifted. The moment when something that had been still began to move. It came about 2 hours past midnight. The movement was to the northeast, toward the road that curved around the burning passage approach. Soren saw it first as a change in the night sky's texture, a dimming, as if something large had passed between the stars and the ash waste. Then he heard it, the minimal sound of multiple horses held in formation, moving with the precise control of trained riders. Not trying to be silent. Just not trying to be loud. He moved. Not toward the camp, not immediately. First toward the high dune that commanded a view of the approach, using the sand's shape to keep his silhouette broken against the darker ridge. The movement took him off the perimeter, which was the correct decision. A good scout did not alert the camp until he had verified what needed alerting about. The riders came into focus as they cleared the ridge to the northeast. 8. They counted again. 9. Maybe more in the darkness, held further back from the firelight they were now permitting themselves to build. Mounted on the kind of horses the Trade Council favored, lean, high-strung animals built for speed across open desert rather than strength. Their gear was minimal, designed for traveling, not fighting. But the insignia was visible even at distance, burned into their saddlecloths, the formal mark of the council's merchant militia. The seal that meant authority. The mark that meant they did not stop for common caravans, they moved through them like water through stones. They were camped on the northeastern approach, roughly where the burning passage began its real narrowing, where the desert opened up and the rock formations started to frame the path. They had not taken a position that would intercept a caravan. They had taken a position that would intercept something that came after a caravan, something that the passage itself was being used to filter. Soren watched them establish the camp with the efficiency of professional soldiers. Horses were picketed. A perimeter was set. Posts were assigned. They were in no hurry. They had the bearing of people who knew exactly what they were waiting for and how long they could wait. He watched for another 10 minutes, verifying the detail, verifying the count, verifying that the insignia was not a trick of the light or a council merchant caravan with a security detail, but actual militia. Then he settled lower against the dune and thought. He had been a soldier. Not a scout exactly, infantry, then a runner, then the quiet work that came after, the kind that taught a man how to watch without being watched. He knew the geometry of ambush. He knew what a staging camp looked like, and what the difference was between a staging camp that meant to intercept the nearest thing moving and one that meant to intercept what came after. These riders had taken the second posture. They had angled themselves toward the far side of the passage. They had built their sightlines toward the road beyond the narrowing, not the road leading to it. The caravan would pass through under their eyes. The caravan, specifically, was not the quarry, which meant two things. 1. Hassoun's message had moved faster than the caravan. The bird or the rider or whatever instrument the Trade Council used for its faster communications had already delivered the content of that message to someone with authority to position militia. That was not a local response. That was institutional weight. 2. Whatever they were waiting for was bigger than a widow and her mage. The scouts were not here for Darian. Not only for Darian. They were here for a converging thing. Something traveling the amber route that would arrive after the Vasrin caravan had cleared the burning passage and marked the air. The caravan was not the prey. The caravan was the bait, or the signal flare, or the first of a sequence. Soren's jaw tightened. He did not speak. He did not move for a long moment. He thought about waking her. It was the instinct of a man who had spent 3 days watching Nara Vasrin run a negotiation against an institutional operator and come out of it carrying tribute and terms and the first recognizable shape of a new partnership. She had earned his trust. She deserved his information. But he thought, too, about the way she had looked that evening at the fire, the specific stillness that had been on her since they cleared the Tal-Veshaan gates. She had known exposure had followed them out. She had accepted it as a cost. She had made her calculations around the idea that the council knew Darian existed and would track the caravan from now on. He did not know, yet, what it would do to those calculations if he put into her hands the fact that the calculations were wrong, that the council was not tracking. It was already ahead of them. He thought about 3 days of travel before the narrowing. 3 days where she would need to rest. 3 days where the crew would need her steady. 3 days where whatever he told her would become the new weight she carried at the front of every wagon. A younger man would have woken her. A worse scout would have woken her. Soren had been a soldier long enough to understand that a report without a picture was half a report. He did not yet know the riders' rotation. He did not know their supply train. He did not know if they would hold position all 3 days, or if they would move before the caravan reached the approach. He did not know whether they intended to let the caravan pass unmolested, which would be consistent with the posture he was reading, or whether that posture was the cover for something else. He needed more. 1 night of watching was not enough. He would stay up. He would watch the rotation. He would see what the scouts did when the sun rose, when the sun peaked, when the sun set again. He would walk the morning perimeter under the cover of routine and get a daylight count. He would see whether the fires doubled by nightfall or thinned. He would confirm, to military standard, what he believed he already knew. And he would carry it alone until the picture was whole enough to hand her. He did not like the decision. It sat wrong against the partnership that had been forming between him and Nara across this leg of the road. But it was the correct decision. A scout reported what he knew. He did not report what he suspected before he could defend it against her questions. And her questions, he could already hear them, would be precise, relentless, and unwilling to wait for the next day's confirmation once she had started asking. 3 days to the narrowing? One of them already spent before this moment. 2 more to collect a picture she could act on. He gave himself that much. He made one more slow traverse of the dune's sightline, memorizing the arrangement of fires, the line of picketed horses, the narrow gap in the rocks beyond which the road ran south into territory the militia would not cross until they had their quarry in view. He marked an approach route he could use by daylight without being seen. He ran through the report he would eventually give, structuring it the way she preferred, facts first, then pattern, then implication. Then he came down off the dune and resumed the perimeter of his own camp. Nara was awake when he passed her tent. Not because he had made a sound. Soren was good at moving silently. But because she was the kind of person who did not sleep deeply, and something in the desert's rhythm had shifted enough to register against the edge of her body. He saw her silhouette through the gap of the tent flap. She was sitting upright, not reaching for a weapon, not calling out. Just awake in the way of someone whose mind had not yet let her off the shift. He did not stop. He did not report. He raised one hand in the half-salute they had been using for days now, the signal that meant all quiet, perimeter is mine, and kept walking. She watched him go. He felt her watch. But she did not call to him, and he did not look back. He had 2 more days. I sat in the dark and did not sleep. I could not have said what had pulled me up out of rest. A shift in the wind, maybe. The pitch of the horse's breathing. The fact that Soren had crossed my line of sight at a pace that was not quite the pace of a man walking a clean perimeter. Or none of those. Maybe only the fact that for 3 days now, since we had cleared the Tal-Veshaan gates with all our terms honored and all our people intact, something in my body had refused to accept the version of the story where honor and intact people were the whole of it. I turned my palm up in the dark and pressed my thumb once hard into the old rope burn, the mark of a choice that had nearly cost me everything, a decade and a lifetime ago. Held the pressure there while my hands, both of them, stupidly, felt faintly feverish against the cooler skin of my wrists. I rubbed them on the blanket and let the sensation pass without naming it. Exposure? That word had sat at the bottom of every calculation since the Cistern. The cost of the stay had been exposure, and I had accepted it as the price of the partnership and the evidence and the door that had opened in me and not yet closed. But exposure was not a single event. Exposure was the first frame of a sequence. And somewhere out beyond the wagons, in the direction of the road that would narrow into the burning passage, a sequence was moving whose shape I could not yet see. Darian slept in the tent beside mine. His breathing was the careful, controlled breathing of a man whose body was paying interest on a debt it had taken on in the cistern chamber and had not yet finished paying. His left hand, when I had caught sight of it at the evening fire, had moved against the rim of his cup with the small, unwilling tremor I had begun to recognize as cost. I did not go to him. I sat with the calculation instead. The council knew. Hassoun had relayed. Some number of days from now, at some point on this road, something would arrive that the knowing would summon. That much I could build without waking anyone. What I could not yet build was the shape of it. And until I had the shape, I could not make my crew carry it with me. Dawn was still hours away. The twin moons had dropped nearly to the horizon. The desert was doing the particular quiet it did before the cold broke and the first movements of the day began. Somewhere past the camp's perimeter, Soren walked his second half of the watch. And somewhere past him, where neither I nor the crew nor Darian yet had eyes, a line of riders waited that none of us had seen. Soren completed another circuit of the perimeter. The northeast riders were still in position. Their fires had dimmed, but their posts remained established. They had the bearing of people who would wait forever if necessary. The bearing of people who knew exactly what they were hunting and how long they could hunt it. He returned to the high dune and looked toward the burning passage, invisible in the darkness but present in the way the desert changed shape, the way the wind moved differently around the rock formations that would frame the approach. 3 days. The caravan would reach the narrowing by evening of the third day, as Soren had calculated. The scouts would have visibility of everything that came after. And whatever Hassoun's message had set in motion would converge on that passage like water flowing to a low point. Soren understood the geometry of it, the patience of it, the institutional certainty that moved at the council's speed, which was the speed of people who did not doubt their right to wait forever for something to arrive. He moved back toward the camp, completing his watch circuit, reporting nothing to wake the crew. And as he moved, a clarity settled into place, the kind that came from military training, from understanding how power positioned itself, from seeing the moment when a trap was sprung even before the prey understood it had been moving toward one all along. The scouts were not waiting for the caravan. "They're not waiting for us," Soren said quietly, speaking to the darkness, speaking to the wind, speaking to no one at all. "They're waiting for what comes after."